Welcome, history enthusiasts, to another journey into the misunderstood realities of the past. Tonight, we're exploring a lifestyle that modern wellness influencers frequently romanticize, the supposedly peaceful, contemplative existence of medieval monks. If you've ever fantasized about the simple life of prayer and scholarly pursuits, imagining stone cloisters and illuminated manuscripts, prepare to have those notions thoroughly challenged. By the time we finish, you may be thanking whatever higher power you believe in that your spiritual practice doesn't involve freezing cells, sleep deprivation, and battles with what medieval theologians considered the most dangerous demon of all, boredom. Before we begin, if you're enjoying these historical reality checks, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Now, let's enter the monastery and discover why medieval monks developed elaborate psychological defenses against what might be the most underestimated challenge of religious devotion, the crushing weight of isolation, repetition, and the endless struggle against their own minds. Waking to darkness, the first hour. Imagine opening your eyes in utter darkness, jerked from sleep by the relentless clanging of a bell. The year is 1237, and you're a Benedictine monk at a monastery in northern England. It's approximately 1:30 in the morning by our modern reckoning, though such precise timekeeping doesn't exist in your world. What matters is that it's time for matins, the first of the 8 daily prayer services that will structure every day of your life until death. The darkness is absolute, especially in winter, when this first waking comes hours before even the faintest hint of dawn. The bitter cold hits you immediately as you pull your wool blanket aside, your only real defense against the frigid stone chamber that serves as your cell. There is no heating beyond perhaps the lingering warmth of a brazier's embers, deliberately left to cool overnight. Physical comfort is considered a dangerous distraction from spiritual matters, a potential gateway to the sin of luxuria, excessive comfort leading to lust. Your cell is Spartan by any standard, approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, containing a straw mattress on a simple wooden platform, a small table that serves as both desk and dining surface, a stool, and perhaps a small chest for your few possessions. A crude crucifix hangs on the wall, and a single manuscript of devotional text awaits your attention during designated reading hours. There's no privacy as we understand it. Your doorway might have a curtain rather than a door, allowing superiors to check your activities at any moment. The first challenge of your day arrives immediately, the battle against your body's desperate desire to return to sleep. This struggle isn't incidental to monastic life, but central to its spiritual purpose. The rule of Saint Benedict, the text governing your daily existence, explicitly designs this nocturnal waking to challenge the flesh. Physical discomfort is a feature, not a bug, of the system, a deliberate test of your commitment and an opportunity to demonstrate triumph of spiritual dedication over bodily weakness. Thomas of Wallingford, a 13th century monk, described this daily awakening as a small death and resurrection, where the comfort of sleep must be sacrificed to the higher calling of prayer. What he didn't record, though other monastic writings reveal, is how this interrupted sleep pattern contributed to a perpetual state of mild sleep deprivation that colored every aspect of monastic experience, creating hallucinatory states that could be interpreted as either divine inspiration or demonic temptation. You don't dress because you've slept in your habit, the ankle-length woolen tunic that serves as your constant garment. Benedictines wear black, though other orders have their own colors, Cistercians in white, Franciscans in brown. The wool is coarse, and underwashing was rare, making skin irritation and parasites constant companions. Your habit has likely been with you for years, repaired rather than replaced, carrying the embedded grime and sweat of countless days of physical labor and prayer. Your feet find your simple leather sandals in the darkness, a luxury in winter when they provide minimal protection against the freezing stone floors. During the coldest months, frostbite and chilblains are common, particularly among older monks. Yet, complaining about such discomforts would demonstrate attachment to physical well-being, a spiritual failing that might require penance. The bell continues its relentless summons as you make your way through dark corridors corridors toward the church, guided by pure muscle memory, and perhaps a single oil lamp at a critical junction. You join the somber procession of your brothers, each emerging from their cells in identical silence, moving like shadows through the darkened cloister. Speech is forbidden during this procession, a rule that will characterize much of your day. The silence isn't merely practical, but spiritual, creating both a sense of sacred purpose and, critically for our examination, eliminating basic human social connection. This choreographed movement through darkness represents your first victory of the day, the triumph of discipline over comfort, of communal obligation over individual desire. But it also marks the beginning of a day structured to prevent the very thing many modern people imagine monastic life to provide: peace of mind. For the medieval monk, the mind was not a place of refuge but a battlefield where salvation and damnation hung in the balance. The theater of prayer, performance under scrutiny. As you enter the church for matins, the real test begins. The cavernous stone space is even colder than your cell, with winter temperatures often dropping below freezing. Your breath forms visible clouds in the faint light of the few candles illuminating the space. Minimal illumination that serves both practical economy and spiritual symbolism of divine light in darkness. You take your assigned place in the choir stalls, wooden seats arranged in rows facing each other across the central aisle. Your position is determined by seniority, with novices and newer monks standing at the ends where they can be easily observed by the more experienced brothers. This arrangement isn't just traditional, it's a crucial element of the surveillance culture that defines monastic life. For the next 2 to 3 hours, you will participate in a complex performance of chanted psalms, readings, and prayers. The matins service is the longest of the day, deliberately scheduled during the hours when the body most craves sleep. The physical demands are considerable, standing for long periods, precise memorization of Latin texts, and maintaining the exact cadence of Gregorian chant according to the day's specific requirements. But the mental challenge is far greater. Every aspect of your performance is under constant scrutiny. The monastic community functions as a panopticon, where each member observes and is observed simultaneously. Mistakes in the liturgy, a mispronounced word, a missed musical note, an improper gesture, are noted and may result in public correction or penance. John of Ford, a Cistercian abbot, wrote that the brothers' eyes should be upon each other, not in judgment but in edification, a euphemistic description of a surveillance system designed to enforce perfect conformity. This constant observation creates a particular kind of psychological pressure that modern people rarely experience. You're never truly unwatched, never able to relax your performance. Even your facial expression during prayer is scrutinized for signs of appropriate devotion. Too somber might indicate despair, too animated could suggest insufficient reverence. The 12th century customary of Aynsham Abbey specifically instructs monks to maintain a moderate countenance, neither excessively severe nor inappropriate in its lightness. The performance aspect extends beyond mere surveillance to the fundamental purpose of the liturgy. Medieval monastic prayer wasn't primarily about personal spiritual experience, but about precise execution of what was essentially a theatrical presentation for divine witness. The monk's role was to perform the perfect prayer on behalf of the world, a responsibility that weighed heavily. Elred of Rievaulx compared the monastic choir to the angels before God's throne, whose every note and gesture must be worthy of heaven's gaze. For those raised in the monastery from childhood, not uncommon, as many monks entered as oblates before the age of 10, this performance pressure might feel normal. But for those who entered as adults, perhaps after a life in the secular world, seeking spiritual meaning or escaping worldly troubles, the adjustment could be shattering. Historical records include accounts of new monks breaking down during services, overwhelmed by the combination of sleep deprivation, physical discomfort, performance anxiety, and the sheer alienness of the experience. The Matins service continues with its complex sequence of psalms, responses, and readings. The rhythm of Latin phrases washes over you, familiar through years of repetition, yet requiring constant attention. Your mind must remain remain focused on the text and its execution, yet this very focus becomes its own challenge. Medieval monastic writers identified a particular form of spiritual attack that would strike during these long services. Invasive thoughts that would intrude despite all efforts at concentration. These unwanted thoughts weren't considered merely natural mental wandering, but actual demonic assaults. The 4th century monk, Evagrius Ponticus, created an influential taxonomy of demons that attacked monks during prayer, including memories of family, fantasies of food, or sexual images. Later, monastic writers elaborated on these categories, creating what amounts to the Western world's first comprehensive psychological framework for understanding intrusive thoughts. The struggle against these mental interruptions wasn't just a spiritual exercise, but a core component of monastic identity. Your ability to maintain perfect attention during hours of Latin chanting, often in a state of exhaustion and discomfort, wasn't merely admired. It was considered evidence of your worthiness for salvation. Johannes Trithemius, a 15th century abbot, wrote that the monk whose mind wanders during the divine office has opened his fortress to the enemy, reflecting the military metaphors commonly used to describe this mental battle. As Matins finally concludes, you've survived the first major challenge of your day, but instead of returning to sleep, as your body desperately desires, you move directly into the Lauds service, which greets the impending dawn. Only after this second round of prayers, typically ending around 4 a.m., will you have a brief period of rest before the day continues with its relentless schedule of prayer, work, and carefully regulated activities. And in this brief respite lies another of the greatest challenges of monastic life: what to do with an unoccupied mind in the pre-dawn darkness of your cell, the demon of noontide, acedia, and the monastic mind. After the morning services of Matins and Lauds, you've returned to your cell for a brief period before prime, the next prayer service at daybreak. This is supposed to be time for contemplative reading or personal prayer, but today you find yourself staring at the stone wall, overwhelmed by a feeling that medieval monastics considered more dangerous than lust, greed, or even pride. Acedia, commonly mistranslated as sloth, acedia represents something far more complex and insidious, a spiritual affliction that combined elements of what we might now call depression, boredom, anxiety, and existential despair. The 4th century monk John Cassian described it as the demon that attacketh in the daytime, a noonday devil that struck monks when the day seemed endless, and every spiritual practice became an unbearable burden. For the medieval monk, acedia wasn't just an emotional state, but an active demonic presence that targeted those dedicated to spiritual life. Its symptoms were described with remarkable psychological insight: restlessness, inability to focus on prayer or reading, invasive thoughts about the outside world, fantasies of different lives that might have been lived, and a creeping sense that the monastic vocation was a terrible mistake. The Desert Father, Evagrius Ponticus, wrote that when acedia attacks, the sun seems to move too slowly or not at all, and the day appears to be 50 hours long. This temporal distortion, the excruciating elongation of time during periods of boredom and isolation, remains one of the most universally recognized symptoms of psychological distress, studied extensively in everything from solitary confinement research to space mission simulations. Sitting on your hard wooden stool in the pre-dawn darkness, you experience this temporal distortion firsthand. The minutes crawl by with excruciating slowness. Your back aches from hours of standing during the night services. Your mind rebels against the devotional text you're supposed to be studying, the Latin words blurring as your thoughts scatter in a dozen forbidden directions. You find yourself thinking about the world outside the monastery walls, perhaps the family you left behind, the taste of foods not permitted in the monastic diet, or simply the freedom to determine your own schedule, rather than having every moment prescribed by the rule. Such thoughts aren't considered normal or innocent by monastic standards, but actively dangerous, the whispers of demons attempting to lure you from your vocation. The treatments prescribed for acedia reveal much about medieval understanding of psychology. Physical labor was considered the primary remedy, a prescription that aligns surprisingly well with modern therapeutic approaches to depression. The rule of Saint Benedict deliberately balanced intellectual and physical activities, recognizing that the mind left to its own devices could become its own worst tormentor. But beyond practical remedies, monastic literature developed elaborate spiritual warfare techniques against acedia. You've been taught to combat these feelings not by addressing their root causes, but by treating them as literal demonic attacks requiring spiritual counteroffensives. The recommended weapons include recitation of specific psalms, visualization of Christ's suffering, self-flagellation to redirect mental anguish to physical pain, and immediate confession to a superior. This last remedy highlights the deeply communal approach to what we would now consider private psychological struggles. Privacy of thought was neither valued nor permitted in medieval monastic life. The rule required regular confession, not just of actions, but of thoughts, a practice that effectively externalized the monitoring of the monk's interior life, creating what amounted to crowdsourced psychological surveillance. The 12th century Cistercian Aelred of Rievaulx encouraged monks to hide nothing of your thoughts from your spiritual father, whether they bring delight or sorrow. This radical transparency meant that your internal struggles with boredom, dissatisfaction, or doubt would become known to the community, making your private psychological state a matter of public concern and intervention. As you sit in your cell, fighting against acedia's creeping influence, you employ the techniques you've been taught, silently reciting Psalm 90. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. Visualizing the physical features of your cell as the wounds of Christ, the door as the spear wound in his side, the walls as his outstretched arms, and mentally reviewing the day's scheduled activities as a shield against unstructured thought. These spiritual technologies represent sophisticated psychological interventions developed over centuries of monastic experience with isolation and routine. They reflect a fundamental understanding that the greatest threat to the monastic vocation wasn't external persecution or physical hardship, but the monk's own mind when confronted with endless repetition, sensory deprivation, and removal from normal human social structures. The bell sounds again, calling you to prime as the first hint of dawn lightens the sky. You rise with a mixture of relief and resignation. Relief at being rescued from your isolated battle with acedia. Resignation at facing yet another carefully choreographed performance of prayer. As you join your brothers processing toward the church, you notice several faces bearing the same strained expression you feel on your own. Fellow soldiers in the invisible war against the noonday demon. The structured day, finding meaning in repetition. As the winter sun finally rises, bringing minimal warmth to the frozen monastery grounds, your day unfolds according to the precise schedule established by the rule. After prime comes a chapter meeting, where the community gathers to hear a reading of one chapter from the Rule of Saint Benedict and receive work assignments and announcements from the abbot. This is also when public confessions and penances occur, brothers acknowledging infractions like falling asleep during prayer, speaking during forbidden hours, or neglecting assigned duties. These public confessions serve multiple purposes in the monastic ecosystem. Beyond the obvious religious dimension of sin and forgiveness, they function as a social control mechanism, creating communal reinforcement of behavioral norms. They also provide one of the few legitimized emotional releases in an environment where emotional expression is otherwise tightly regulated. John of Salisbury noted that monks would sometimes exaggerate minor infractions in confession, suggesting a psychological need for the catharsis this ritual provided. Following chapter meeting comes the period for manual labor, a crucial component of Benedictine life that serves practical, spiritual, and psychological functions. Today, you're assigned to the scriptorium, the writing room, where manuscripts are copied and illuminated. This represents one of the more desirable work assignments, as it takes place indoors and involves intellectual rather than purely physical labor. The scriptorium operates under strict rules designed to maintain both quality of production and spiritual discipline. Conversation is forbidden, with necessary communication handled through a system of hand signals. More than 120 such signs were developed in medieval monasteries, creating a silent language that covered everything from requesting specific writing materials to reporting a mistake in a text. Your task today is simple but demanding, copying a theological commentary onto prepared parchment. The physical aspects alone require intense concentration, maintaining consistent letter forms, managing ink that must be neither too fluid nor too thick, and handling precious parchment that represents weeks of preparation and significant economic value. A serious error could necessitate scraping away the ink with a knife and starting again, or, in worst cases, wasting the entire sheet. But the greater challenge is maintaining focus on a text that holds little intrinsic interest for you personally. The commentary discusses theological minutiae regarding the nature of divine providence, important from a doctrinal perspective, but lacking the narrative engagement of Scripture or the practical applications of instructional texts. Hour after hour, you must copy words that frequently fail to capture your full attention, creating perfect conditions for the return of acedia. The medieval solution to this challenge reveals much about monastic psychology. You've been taught to approach copying not as a mechanical task, but as a physically embodied prayer. Each perfectly formed letter becomes an offering to God, each completed line a step on the spiritual journey. The 9th century monk Notker the Stammerer wrote that the fingers write of Christ's glory while the mind contemplates divine rewards, illustrating how manual tasks were mentally reframed as meaningful spiritual exercises. This cognitive reframing represents an early understanding of what modern psychology would call flow states, or meaningful work engagement. By connecting repetitive tasks to transcendent purpose, monastic culture developed sophisticated techniques for finding meaning in activities that might otherwise become unbearable in their monotony. Similar principles applied to all forms of manual labor within the monastery. Whether working in the gardens, kitchen, brewery, or fields, monks were expected to maintain both physical discipline and spiritual mindfulness. The 12th century Cistercian statutes specified that even during harvest, the most physically demanding season, brothers must maintain regular intervals of silent prayer while working, mentally transforming physical exhaustion into spiritual offering. After several hours in the scriptorium, the bell calls you to terce, the mid-morning prayer service. This briefer office provides both spiritual refreshment and physical relief from the hunched position of writing. Your back and eyes are grateful for the change, though you're careful not to express such physical concerns openly. Comfort-seeking remains suspect in the monastic worldview. Following terce comes continued labor until the midday meal, accompanied by the office of sext. The winter menu is predictably sparse: a thin vegetable pottage with bread and small beer, low-alcohol ale safer than water. During the meal, all attention focuses on a brother reading aloud from spiritual texts. No social conversation occurs, maintaining the day's pervasive silence. The rule specifies that meals should provide adequate nutrition without satisfaction, as culinary pleasure represents another potential attachment to physical experience. However, the historical reality varied considerably between orders and even specific monasteries. While Cistercians maintained rigid simplicity in diet, primarily vegetables, bread, and legumes, some Benedictine houses eventually developed complex culinary traditions, particularly on feast days. These variations reflect the constant tension between spiritual austerity and institutional pragmatism that characterized monastic development. Communities that embraced excessive physical deprivation often suffered unsustainable attrition through illness or departure, while those that became too comfortable risked losing spiritual focus and external respect. Each monastery negotiated this balance based on its particular circumstances, leadership, and historical moment. After the midday meal comes the brief opportunity for rest or personal reading before none, the early afternoon prayer office. In summer, this rest period might include actual sleep to compensate for the shortened night, but winter's schedule typically allows only quiet contemplation, perhaps while warming yourself near the rare heated space in the calefactory, the only common room with a fire outside the kitchen and infirmary. The afternoon brings more labor, followed by vespers as daylight fades. The evening meal, lighter than midday fare, precedes compline, the final prayer office that prepares the community for the great silence of night. By modern standards, your day has been exhaustingly structured, with activities changing precisely at the sound of bells regardless of natural completion points or personal preferences. This rigid temporal structure, what historians call the monastic horologium, represents more than mere scheduling. It constitutes a complete reordering of human temporal experience, subordinating natural rhythms and individual inclinations to institutional routine. The bells don't merely announce time, they claim ownership of it, transforming time itself from a natural flow into a series of containers for prescribed activities. For the medieval monk, this surrender of temporal autonomy was not incidental, but essential to the spiritual project. The 12th century Cistercian Adam of Persain wrote that the bells are Christ's voice calling us from ourselves, articulating how schedule became salvation, routine, a path to redemption. The totally structured day served as both spiritual discipline and psychological defense against the very isolation and repetition it imposed. As night falls and you process toward your cell after compline, you carry the mixed psychological legacy of this structured existence, the frustration of never completing tasks according to their natural rhythm, alongside the security of always knowing what comes next. This paradoxical experience, simultaneously constraining and comforting, defined the monastic approach to managing the mind in isolation. The night office, darkness, and temptation. After compline, the great silence descends upon the monastery. Unlike the controlled silence of daily activities, where some functional communication remains permitted, this nighttime silence is absolute. No words, gestures, or interactions of any kind are allowed until the following day's services begin. You return to your cell in this profound silence, the darkness of winter making the journey treacherous despite your familiarity with every stone in the path. This period between compline and sleep represents one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of monastic life. After a day of constant activity and communal presence, you suddenly find yourself alone with your thoughts in near total sensory deprivation. Darkness, silence, and physical stillness creating perfect conditions for the mind to turn upon itself. Medieval monastic writings identified this time as particularly dangerous for what they termed nocturnal emissions, both literal sexual experiences during sleep and the broader category of forbidden thoughts that emerged in darkness. The 11th century Cluniac customaries included elaborate rituals for sleeping positions designed to minimize the possibility of sexual arousal. Lying on the right side with hands visible above the blankets, knees slightly bent in a position that supposedly reduced blood flow to the genitals. Beyond these physical precautions, monks developed sophisticated cognitive techniques for managing the transition to sleep. The recommended practice involved focused meditation on specific biblical scenes, usually the Nativity or Crucifixion, visualized in elaborate sensory detail. This early form of guided imagery served multiple purposes, displacing unwanted thoughts, maintaining spiritual focus, and productively occupying the mind during the vulnerable period between wakefulness and sleep. John of Fécam's 11th century meditation guide instructed monks to build within your mind the stable at Bethlehem, constructing each detail until you can walk within it in your thoughts, approaching the Holy Family as if physically present. This immersive visualization practice required considerable mental discipline, but provided powerful psychological protection against the anxiety, loneliness, and forbidden thoughts that threatened during the night hours. Not all monks succeeded in this mental management. Records from monastic penitentials, guides for appropriate penances, include extensive sections addressing nocturnal emissions and sexual dreams, indicating their frequency despite preventive measures. The prescribed responses ranged from additional fasting to special prayers to physical self-punishment, all designed to purify the monk from pollution considered at least partially involuntary yet still dangerous to spiritual progress. The monastic night also brought legitimate terrors beyond these psychological challenges. Medieval monasteries were vulnerable to very real dangers: fire from unattended candles, intruders seeking to steal valuable religious objects, and in some regions and periods, violent attacks from raiders or hostile local powers. The monastery's isolation, spiritually advantageous for removing worldly distractions, created physical vulnerability that added a layer of genuine anxiety to the nighttime experience. As you lie on your hard bed, the straw mattress providing minimal cushioning against the wooden platform, you employ the techniques you've been taught for managing the night hours. You mentally recite the psalms assigned for protection against nocturnal fears, particularly Psalm 91 with its reassurance that He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. You visualize your cell as sacred space, protected by angelic presence at each corner. These psychological techniques reflect sophisticated understanding of how to manage anxiety in isolation. Modern research on astronauts, Arctic researchers, and others experiencing extended isolation has rediscovered many similar approaches: routine, visualization, reframing of physical space, and mental disciplines that occupy cognitive capacity that might otherwise fixate on fears or prohibited thoughts. The night passes in cycles of fitful sleep and wakeful anxiety, the poor insulation of your cell admitting bitter drafts that make true rest elusive. The winter night stretches interminably, with true darkness lasting 14 hours or more in northern latitudes. This seasonal reality significantly impacted monastic psychology, with records showing increased reports of spiritual struggles, visions, both divine and demonic, and rule infractions during winter's extended darkness. The historical evidence suggests that seasonal affective disorders affected medieval monastic communities just as they do modern populations, though interpreted through religious rather than clinical frameworks. The 12th century English monk Adam of Aynsham recorded that the brothers' spirits fail more readily in the dark months, when demons seem to crowd the very air and temptations multiply. Modern research confirms the neurochemical reality behind this observation, with decreased sunlight exposure affecting mood regulation through altered melatonin and serotonin production. Eventually, the bell tolls again for matins, beginning another day identical in structure to the one before. This cycle, the endless repetition of days, seasons, and years following the same pattern, constituted both the greatest spiritual discipline and the greatest psychological challenge of monastic life. The Latin phrase stabilitas loci, stability of place, captured this cornerstone of Benedictine practice, the commitment to remain in one monastery for life, performing the same routines until death. This radical stability contrasts sharply with modern values of variety, growth, and change. Contemporary psychology generally considers novelty and stimulation essential to mental health, with their absence potentially causing depression and cognitive decline. Yet medieval monasticism deliberately eliminated novelty, creating an environment where sameness was not merely accepted but idealized as spiritual achievement. Understanding how monks managed this extreme stability without widespread psychological collapse reveals much about human adaptability and the power of meaning-making in extreme circumstances. The monastic solution centered on minute attention to subtle variations within apparent sameness, finding infinite spiritual depth in repeated rituals, texts, and practices, rather than seeking extensive horizontal experiences. The 12th century Cistercian Guerric of Igny wrote that the monk who complains of repetition has not yet begun to pray, for true prayer finds the divine mysteries inexhaustible, even in a single word repeated 1,000 times. This approach, finding infinite depth within extreme limitation, represents a psychological technology for managing isolation and repetition that remains relevant to modern extreme environments, from space stations to pandemic lockdowns. As you rise once more in darkness for matins, you carry the accumulated weight of interrupted sleep alongside the spiritual framework that transforms this deprivation into meaningful sacrifice. The complexity of this experience, simultaneously depleting and purposeful, defined the psychological reality of medieval monastic life, creating neither the romanticized tranquility of modern imagination nor simple historical misery, but something far more nuanced, a complete system for managing the mind under conditions of isolation, repetition, and constraint. Community without intimacy, the social paradox. As daylight finally returns and the monastery awakens to another day, you join your brothers in the warming room, one of the rare communal spaces with a fire during winter. This brief gathering before morning tasks begin represents one of the few opportunities for social interaction, though even here, conversation remains limited by both formal rules and cultural norms. The complex social reality of monastic life confounds modern expectations. Contrary to popular imagination, monks were rarely true hermits. Those were specifically called eremitic monks, distinct from the more common cenobitic or community-based monastic life. You live surrounded by dozens or even hundreds of brothers in large monasteries, in constant proximity that would suggest intimate community. Yet this proximity exists alongside stringent restrictions on meaningful personal connection. The rule explicitly limits private conversation, forbids exclusive friendships between monks, particular attachments, and creates a social environment based on universal brotherhood rather than individual connection. This creates the paradoxical experience of constant human presence without the psychological benefits of genuine intimacy, a unique form of isolation within community that modern research would identify as profoundly challenging to mental health. The 12th century customary of St. Victor's Abbey codified this approach, stating that brothers shall love all equally in Christ, having special friendship with none. This prohibition on special friendships, amicitiae speciales, reflected both theological principles of universal love and practical concerns about community stability, as close personal bonds might create factions or tempt monks away from their vocation. Yet historical evidence suggests that human nature frequently overcame these restrictions. Records of monastic discipline are filled with penalties for monks who formed exactly these forbidden intimate friendships. The frequency of such infractions indicates the psychological necessity of close personal bonds, even in environments explicitly designed to redirect such attachment toward divine rather than human objects. The warming room conversation this morning follows the established pattern. Brothers discuss practical matters, tasks requiring coordination, minor maintenance needs for monastic buildings, adjustments to liturgical practice for the approaching feast day. Personal feelings, doubts, struggles, or joys remain largely unspoken, considered either irrelevant to communal function or appropriately shared only with specific spiritual superiors rather than peers. This emotional restraint represents another significant psychological challenge. Modern understanding of mental health emphasizes the importance of emotional expression and social sharing of internal states, the monastic requirement to maintain impassive exterior, regardless of interior struggle, created what psychologists would now recognize as a classic condition for emotional suppression and its associated negative effects on well-being. Yet medieval monastic psychology wasn't ignorant of these challenges. The institution of the spiritual director, or soul friend, Anamkara in Celtic monastic tradition, recognized the necessity of emotional disclosure while channeling it through approved hierarchical relationships rather than peer bonding. Every monk was assigned a spiritual father to whom he could, indeed must, reveal his inner struggles, receiving guidance and absolution within this structured relationship. The 9th century Irish penitential of Cummian instructed that the diseases of the soul, like the diseases of the body, cannot be healed until they are revealed to the soul's physician. This medicalization of emotional disclosure demonstrates sophisticated understanding of psychological needs, even as the broader monastic structure limited their expression in ways modern sensibilities would find restrictive. As morning progresses and you move from the warming room to your assigned tasks, you navigate the complex social geography of the monastery. Despite prohibitions on exclusive friendships, human nature ensures that you interact differently with different brothers. Some you instinctively trust or enjoy, others you subtly avoid when possible, and a few inspire active aversion managed through rigorous self-discipline. The historical record preserves evidence of these natural social dynamics breaking through institutional constraints. Letters between monks, while ostensibly focused on theological matters, often contain thinly veiled expressions of personal affection. Obituary notices, commemorations of deceased brothers, sometimes abandon formal language to reveal genuine grief and specific appreciated qualities of the departed. Even architectural elements like window placements and common room layouts show evidence of adaptation to facilitate discrete interaction beyond official guidelines. These persistent human connections within an ostensibly equality-driven system created what historian C.H. Lawrence called an underground network of affinities, existing beneath the surface of official monastic relationships. This wasn't simply rule-breaking, but a necessary psychological adaptation that allowed the monastic system to continue without complete emotional collapse of its participants. The tension between human attachment needs and spiritual ideals of universal, undifferentiated love created significant psychological strain, particularly evident in monastic writing about mastering emotions. The ideal monk was expected to feel compassion without particular attachment, to care for brothers who irritated him exactly as much as those who brought comfort, and to sever all emotional bonds with family outside the monastery. A collection of emotional regulations that modern psychology would identify as potentially traumatic. Your lived experience reflects this strain. Despite years of practice, you find yourself feeling natural human responses to those around you. Appreciation for Brother Thomas's quiet humor during difficult tasks, irritation at Brother William's persistent throat clearing during readings, concern for elderly Brother Matthew's declining health. These normal emotional responses must be carefully managed, neither suppressed entirely, which would constitute the sin of indifference, nor indulged fully, which would violate the principle of universal charity. The midday meal provides another window into this complex social reality. Seated according to seniority rather than affinity, you eat in silence while listening to the reader sharing passages from Gregory's Moralia in Job. Physical proximity without meaningful interaction again characterizes the experience. Dozens of men sharing space and purpose without the conventional social bonding that normally accompanies communal meals. After the meal, you join 3 other brothers in the herb garden, one of the few settings where limited conversation about the task at hand is permitted. This practical necessity creates small opportunities for human connection, though always under the watchful eyes of the community. Even here, centuries of monastic experience have developed nonverbal efficiency that minimizes necessary speech, a system of gestures, nods, and anticipated needs that allows complex cooperative work with minimal verbal exchange. The social technology of medieval monasticism represents a sophisticated system for channeling human connection needs toward institutional rather than interpersonal satisfaction. By creating strong identification with the community As an entity, while limiting individual bonds within it, the system attempted to redirect attachment from specific humans to both the divine and the institution itself, what modern psychology might describe as replacing interpersonal attachment with ideological commitment. The success of this system varied widely across individuals, communities, and historical periods. Some monks appear to have genuinely thrived under these conditions, finding the regulated communal life intellectually stimulating and spiritually fulfilling despite its interpersonal limitations. Others suffered acutely, with records of monks fleeing the monastery, developing physical manifestations of psychological distress, or creating covert systems for meeting basic human connection needs despite institutional restrictions. As evening approaches and the community gathers for Vespers, you take your place in the familiar choir arrangement, surrounded by the same brothers you see every day, many of whom you've lived alongside for decades. You know their voices, their habits, their subtle expressions. Yet institutional barriers ensure you may never truly know their inner lives, their doubts, fears, or joys, except in the most general theological terms. This paradox, intimate knowledge without intimate connection, defined the distinctive social psychology of medieval monastic life. Creative survival, finding freedom within confinement. After the evening meal, you return to your cell for the period before compline, a brief window of relative autonomy within the rigidly structured day. How monks use these small pockets of unregulated time reveals much about human creativity and resilience under constraint. Historical evidence shows that these moments became crucial for personal expression, intellectual exploration, and psychological survival within the monastic system. Tonight, after checking that no one observes your door, you remove a small wooden box from beneath your bed. Inside lies your private intellectual passion, detailed astronomical calculations tracking the movements of planets, recorded on scraps of parchment salvaged from damaged manuscripts. This independent scholarly pursuit exists in the gray area of monastic regulations, not forbidden outright as it relates to the legitimate field of computations for determining feast days, yet suspiciously self-directed rather than assigned by superiors. Your astronomical work represents a common pattern in medieval monastic psychology, finding legitimate channels for individual interests and talents within institutional constraints. The historical record abounds with evidence of monks pursuing specialized knowledge beyond their assigned duties, botanical studies, mathematical explorations, mechanical innovations, artistic elaborations, all justified through tenuous connections to communal benefit or spiritual development. The 12th century monk Theophilus detailed metalworking techniques in his treatise On Diverse Arts, ostensibly to beautify church objects, but clearly reflecting personal fascination with the technical processes involved. The 13th century Franciscan Roger Bacon conducted optical experiments supposedly to better understand divine light, though his writings reveal unmistakable scientific curiosity, extending far beyond theological application. The 9th century Irish monk Dykewil compiled geographical knowledge from various sources, creating a personal compendium of world information that far exceeded any practical monastic need. These historical examples demonstrate how individuals negotiated space for intellectual autonomy within systems designed to subordinate individual interests to communal purposes. This negotiation wasn't merely rule-breaking, but a sophisticated psychological adaptation that allowed talented individuals to remain within the monastic framework while satisfying deeper needs for competence, curiosity, and personal meaning. Beyond intellectual pursuits, monastery records reveal numerous creative adaptations for managing the psychological challenges of the environment. Small, personalized devotional objects, privately carved wooden crosses, hand-copied prayer books with personal annotations, or customized rosary beads appear frequently in archaeological evidence and inventory records. These items represented acceptable channels for self-expression and created psychological anchors in an environment that deliberately minimized personal possessions. Some adaptations took more social forms despite restrictions on particular friendships. Records from various monasteries show evidence of informal subgroups forming around shared interests or backgrounds. Monks from similar geographical origins gravitating together during permitted conversation times. Those with scholarly interests finding ways to collaborate on projects. Brothers with musical talents developing special arrangements for their monastery's unique liturgical needs. The customary of Aynsham Abbey, 13th century, contains specific prohibitions against such grouping tendencies, instructing supervisors to separate brothers who seek each other's company too frequently. Evidence that natural social affinity persistently reasserted itself despite institutional discouragement. These informal connections provided crucial psychological support that helped individual monks navigate the otherwise depersonalized communal environment. Even within the strictly regulated realm of religious devotion, individual adaptation flourished. Personal devotional practices, particular prayers, specific visualization techniques, private devotions to certain saints, created space for psychological autonomy while remaining within orthodox boundaries. The explosion of private devotional literature in the 13th and 14th centuries reflects this increasing need for individualized spiritual experience within the communal framework. As you complete your astronomical calculations by candlelight, carefully replacing the precious scraps in their hidden container, you're participating in this long tradition of creative adaptation. Your small act of intellectual self-determination doesn't reject monastic values, but customizes them to your particular mind, creating psychological sustainability within institutional uniformity. The bell sounds for Compline, calling you to the day's final communal prayer. You extinguish your candle and join the procession toward the church, externally indistinguishable from brothers who have found their own methods of psychological adaptation. Some have developed elaborate memory palaces where they mentally travel during long services. Others have cultivated minute attention to the changing natural world visible from monastery windows, while still others have created rich interior dialogue with divine figures that sustains them through external silence. These diverse internal adaptations existed alongside more problematic coping mechanisms. Monastery records document the perennial challenges of excessive drinking, food hoarding, aggressive behavior, and various forms of rule breaking that likely represented maladaptive responses to the psychological pressures of the environment. The frequency of regulations against such behaviors suggests their persistence despite institutional efforts at suppression. The 13th century statutes from multiple Benedictine houses contain increasingly detailed prohibitions against private food supplies, suggesting that monks regularly attempted to supplement the official diet, perhaps responding to genuine nutritional needs, but also likely seeking comfort through familiar foods, or asserting some control over bodily experience in an environment that severely restricted such autonomy. Similar patterns appear regarding alcohol consumption. While moderate wine or ale was permitted in most monastic rules, records of disciplinary actions show frequent infractions involving excessive drinking, given the limited opportunities for pleasure, relaxation, or altered consciousness in monastic life. These violations likely represented attempts to temporarily escape the psychological demands of perpetual self-monitoring and emotional regulation. The frequency of these infractions across different monasteries and time periods suggests not merely individual moral failings, but systematic psychological pressure points in the monastic lifestyle itself. The very persistence of certain behaviors despite increasingly severe penalties indicates their function as necessary adaptations to an environment that demanded more than many individuals could sustainably provide. As Compline concludes and the great silence descends once more, you return to your cell with the complex psychological legacy of these adaptations. Your astronomical calculations have provided temporary intellectual freedom and personal competence. practice. The communal prayers have connected you to institutional meaning larger than individual experience. The brief exchanges with selected brothers during permitted work conversations have satisfied minimal social needs. Together, these adaptations make the otherwise unbearable constraints of monastic life not merely endurable, but occasionally meaningful. This delicate psychological ecosystem, negotiating rigid external control through creative internal adaptation, defined the lived experience of medieval monasticism beyond both romantic idealization and simplistic narratives of oppression. The candle extinguished. You lie in darkness contemplating tomorrow's identical schedule with its hidden opportunities for these small freedoms. The winter wind howls outside your window, the stone walls radiating cold despite the small brazier's fading embers. In this moment between wakefulness and sleep, you exist at the intersection of institutional regulation and human adaptation, the defining paradox of the monastic mind. The breaking point. When adaptation fails, not all monks successfully adapted to the psychological challenges of monastic life. Historical records document numerous cases of breakdown, departure, or extreme behavioral disturbances that reveal the limits of human adaptation to this demanding environment. Understanding these failures provides crucial perspective on the lived reality behind idealized descriptions of monastic serenity. 3 days have passed since you last saw Brother Stephen at communal prayers. His absence, explained by the infirmarian as a spiritual illness requiring isolation, has sparked whispered speculation during the few permitted conversation periods. This morning, passing the infirmary on your way to the herb garden, you glimpse him through a half-open door, seated on a bench, staring vacantly at the wall, his lips moving in what might be prayer or simply disordered speech. Brother Stephen's condition represents what medieval monastic authorities called acedia in its fullness, the complete overwhelming of adaptive capacity by the psychological demands of monastic life. Modern clinicians might diagnose major depression, psychotic break, or the effects of extreme stress on vulnerable individuals. The medieval framework, instead, understood such cases through a combination of medical, spiritual, and moral perspectives that created a complex approach to psychological disturbance. The treatment for such conditions revealed sophisticated, if sometimes contradictory, understanding of mental health. The affected monk would typically be relieved of regular duties and liturgical obligations, provided better food and warmer accommodations than normally permitted, and assigned a senior brother for constant supervision and spiritual counsel. This approach combined what we would now recognize as practical interventions, improved nutrition, rest, reduced stress, with spiritual frameworks that maintained institutional cohesion. Monastery records from across Europe document numerous cases resembling Brother Stephen's. The 11th century chronicle of Saint-Bertin mentions a monk who fell into such melancholy that he ceased speaking entirely for 2 years, taking food only when compelled until merciful death released him from his suffering. The infirmary accounts from Cluny record treatments for brothers experiencing visions of terror, uncontrollable weeping, and paralysis of will that prevented normal function. These historical cases likely represent a combination of conditions that modern psychiatry would distinguish more precisely: major depressive episodes, psychotic disorders, reactions to extreme stress, and the effects of nutritional deficiencies or infectious diseases with neurological impacts. The medieval monastic context interpreted all these through spiritual and moral frameworks that simultaneously provided meaning and imposed additional psychological burden through concepts of personal failing or demonic influence. Not all psychological breakdowns took such visible forms. The monastic record contains extensive evidence of more subtle maladaptations that nonetheless indicate significant distress. Persistent rule-breaking, escape attempts, excessive sleeping, obsessive behaviors, and somatic symptoms, physical manifestations of psychological distress, all appear frequently in disciplinary records and medical accounts from from various monasteries. The 13th century customary of Westminster Abbey includes detailed procedures for handling monks who repeatedly escape, indicating the frequency of such attempts despite the severe social and practical consequences of abandoning monastic vows. These fugitive monks represented the most explicit rejection of monastic psychology, literally fleeing the environmental conditions they found unbearable. More common were monks who remained physically present while psychologically withdrawing through various forms of passive resistance or minimal compliance. Disciplinary records frequently mention brothers who consistently arrived late to services, performed their duties with deliberate slowness, or found medical excuses to avoid the most demanding aspects of monastic routine. These behaviors likely represented psychological self-preservation when full compliance exceeded individual capacity. Brother Stephen's vacant stare and isolation in the infirmary represent the extreme end of a spectrum of responses to monastic psychological demands. His breakdown makes visible the pressures affecting all monks to varying degrees: the constant self-monitoring, the sleep disruption, the sensory restriction, the limitation of personal autonomy, and the complex emotional regulations required by communal life. For every dramatic case like Brother Stephen's, historical evidence suggests dozens of monks experiencing less visible but significant psychological distress. Physical symptoms with likely psychological components appear constantly in monastic medical records: digestive disorders, chronic headaches, mysterious pains, skin conditions exacerbated by stress, and sleep disturbances beyond those mandated by the monastic schedule. The 12th century medical writings of Hildegard of Bingen, herself a Benedictine abbess, show remarkable insight into these psychosomatic connections. She described conditions like the pressing of the heart, likely anxiety attacks, and melancholy of the spleen, depressive symptoms with both spiritual and physical treatments, demonstrating the medieval monastic understanding of mind-body connections long before modern psychosomatic medicine. As you continue to the herb garden, passing the infirmary where Brother Stephen remains under close supervision, you consider your own psychological adaptations with new awareness, the private astronomical calculations that provide intellectual autonomy, the carefully maintained connections with selected brothers despite prohibitions on particular friendships, the elaborate visualization practices that create interior spaces beyond institutional control, all represent your personal adaptations to pressures that have overwhelmed Brother Stephen's capacity. This recognition of differential vulnerability appears throughout monastic writings. The 6th century Rule of the Master, a precursor to Benedict's rule, acknowledges that not all vessels are fired in the kiln with equal strength, recognizing that identical conditions produce different outcomes depending on individual characteristics. This understanding created a certain flexibility within the seemingly rigid monastic system, with customary practices allowing accommodations for those showing signs of extreme distress. The monastic approach to psychological breakdown combined pragmatic intervention with institutional self-protection. Brothers experiencing severe disturbance would typically be removed from communal activities, both for their own recovery and to prevent disruption to others. The justification combined medical understanding with spiritual interpretation, framing psychological disturbance as simultaneously physical affliction, spiritual trial, and potential moral failing depending on specific circumstances and symptoms. This multifaceted framework allowed the monastic system to acknowledge the reality of psychological breakdown without fundamentally questioning the environmental conditions that contributed to it. Individual vulnerability, rather than institutional demands, typically received emphasis in explanatory frameworks, preserving the system while accommodating its casualties. By afternoon, word spreads that Brother Stephen has been transferred to a dependent cell, a smaller monastic outpost with less rigid scheduling and fewer communal demands. This common approach to managing severe psychological disturbance removed the affected individual from the main community while maintaining institutional connection. Such transfers represented an implicit acknowledgement that the full monastic regimen regimen exceeded some individuals' adaptive capacity, though this was rarely stated explicitly. As you take your place in the choir for Vespers, the empty space where Brother Stephen normally stood serves as visible reminder of the psychological fragility underlying the monastery's apparent stability. Tomorrow, you will continue your own adaptations, perhaps with renewed attention to their importance for psychological survival. For now, your voice joins the others in the familiar chants, the communal sound creating temporary shelter from the awareness of vulnerability that Brother Stephen's absence has awakened. Beyond the walls, interactions with the outside world. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval monasteries were rarely completely isolated from secular society. Most maintained complex relationships with surrounding communities, regional politics, and broader church structures. These necessary interactions with the outside world created both opportunities and challenges for monks attempting to maintain psychological separation from secular concerns while managing practical engagement with worldly affairs. Today, you've been assigned an unusual task that highlights this tension, accompanying the cellarer, the monk responsible for the monastery's provisions, to the nearby town for the seasonal market. This rare excursion beyond monastery walls represents both privilege and test, a break from routine that offers stimulation and potential temptation in equal measure. The psychological impact of these occasional ventures into secular space was significant. Monastery records and personal writings reveal varied responses. Some monks dreaded such exposures to worldly life as spiritual hazards, others eagerly anticipated them as respite from monastic routine, while many experienced complex mixtures of anticipation and anxiety about temporarily re-entering environments they had theoretically renounced. The 13th century customs of various Benedictine houses included detailed protocols for monks traveling outside the monastery, with particular attention to psychological boundaries. These regulations managed everything from permissible conversations, limited to necessary business, appropriate gaze, eyes kept lowered, particularly when passing women, and mental discipline, continuous prayer or meditation while traveling to maintain interior focus despite external distractions. These elaborate precautions reflected institutional awareness of how powerfully sensory stimulation and social interaction could disrupt the careful psychological conditioning of monastic life. Even brief exposure to the sights, sounds, smells, and social dynamics of secular society threatened to reawaken desires and attachments that monastic practice worked systematically to diminish. As you and the cellarer, Brother Thomas, pass through the monastery gate, the psychological shift is immediate. The sensory landscape expands dramatically. The forest path offers changing vistas rather than the familiar stone walls and enclosed gardens of the monastery. Birdsong replaces the predictable rhythm of bells and chanted psalms. Even the air seems different, carrying scents of woodland vegetation and distant cooking fires rather than the perpetual incense and candle wax of the church. Brother Thomas, a senior monk who has held the cellarer position for 12 years, demonstrates the expected approach to this temporary worldly exposure. As you walk, he leads a recitation of the travel psalms traditionally used to maintain spiritual focus during journeys. His eyes remain mostly downcast except when necessary for safe progress, and his conversation focuses exclusively on the provisions needed and budget constraints affecting purchases. Your own response is more complex. Despite years of monastic discipline, you find your attention repeatedly captured by the changing environment. A flash of movement from a deer in the underbrush, the particular quality of sunlight filtering through leaves, the distant sound of a woodcutter's axe, marking human activity beyond monastic regulation. These sensory experiences trigger memories and associations that momentarily disrupt your participation in the travel prayers. This struggle for psychological containment during external exposure reveals much about the monastic relationship with the wider world. The monastery existed not in true isolation, but in deliberate tension with secular society, physically separated, yet economically and politically connected, spiritually distanced, yet serving intercessory functions for the outside community. As you approach the town, the sensory stimulation intensifies. The market square presents a concentrated assault on monastic sensory discipline. The cacophony of merchants calling their wares, the rich and varied smells of food stalls serving dishes excluded from monastic diet, the visual riot of colored fabrics and diverse faces after years of identical black habits and familiar brothers. Even with disciplined attention, complete psychological separation becomes nearly impossible. Brother Thomas navigates this challenging environment with practiced efficiency, moving directly to specific vendors for grain, salt, and other necessities. His interactions remain minimal and focused, limiting exposure to secular social patterns. You follow his example, though your less experienced discipline allows more sensory distraction and emotional response to this rare immersion in the world beyond monastery walls. The historical record shows that such market trips often became flashpoints for monastic discipline issues. Monastery accounts and visitation reports, records from official inspections, frequently mention brothers returning from outside errands with forbidden items, signs of intoxication, or reports of inappropriate interactions with townspeople. The 14th century visitation records from multiple English Benedictine houses specifically address the problem of monks lingering unnecessarily in towns after completing their assigned business. These consistent behavioral patterns across different monasteries and time periods reveal the psychological strain created by the monastic relationship with the outside world. The theoretical ideal of complete separation conflicted with practical necessity, creating situations where individuals experience the stress of attempting to maintain internal psychological boundaries while physically present in environments designed for very different values and experiences. In the market square, you observe how townsfolk react to monastic presence, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and occasionally barely concealed resentment. The monastery's economic power as major landowner and employer creates complex social dynamics with the surrounding community. Secular attitudes toward monks combined reverence for their spiritual role with awareness of the institution's material advantages and sometimes exploitative economic position. This ambivalent reception created another psychological challenge for monks temporarily engaging with the outside world. The identity carefully constructed within monastery walls, centered on spiritual vocation and communal belonging, encountered external perspectives ranging from genuine respect to barely concealed mockery. Records from various European monasteries document lay people deliberately tempting monks with prohibited items, testing their adherence to vows, or subjecting them to sarcastic comments about monastic wealth and privilege. Brother Thomas completes the necessary transactions efficiently, then turns toward the town church rather than immediately returning to the monastery. "We will pray sext before journeying back," he explains, maintaining the holy offices despite worldly surroundings. This standard practice for traveling monks served multiple purposes: maintaining liturgical obligation regardless of location, physically removing monks from secular spaces during prayer times, and reinforcing psychological separation through familiar ritual in unfamiliar environment. Inside the parish church, simpler than your monastery's elaborate structure but still consecrated space, you and Brother Thomas recite the familiar midday office. The psychological effect is immediately centering, the well-known words and rhythms temporarily restoring the mental framework disrupted by market exposure. This adaptive use of ritual to reestablish psychological boundaries demonstrates the sophisticated self-regulation techniques embedded in monastic practice. The return journey carries different psychological weight than the outward path. You now process the accumulated sensory and social exposures, mentally cataloging what must be set aside to re-enter monastic mindset. Brother Thomas leads the prayers with increased focus, recognizing the need for spiritual recentering after worldly engagement. The monastery's walls appear on the horizon with paradoxical impact. simultaneously representing constraint and psychological safety, limitation, and spiritual purpose. This complex relationship with the outside world fundamentally shaped monastic psychology. The theoretical ideal of complete separation in the world, but not of it in theological terms, created both motivation for psychological discipline and inevitable cognitive dissonance when practical necessity required worldly engagement. This tension appears consistently in monastic writings, with authors acknowledging the spiritual risk of external exposure while recognizing its institutional necessity. The 12th century Cistercian Aelred of Rievaulx captured this tension when writing that monks must carry their cloister with them when traveling beyond monastery walls, a metaphor for maintaining internal psychological boundaries despite physical presence in secular spaces. This portable mental cloister represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of monastic psychological training, creating what amounted to a transportable psychological environment that could theoretically maintain separation despite external exposure. As you pass through the monastery gate returning from the market, you experience the distinctive psychological transition that characterized medieval monastic relationship with the outside world. The familiar enclosure simultaneously represents restriction and relief, constraint and comfort, the paradoxical security of limitations that define monastic psychology. Tomorrow, you will return to cloistered routine with both renewed appreciation for its predictable structure and subtle disturbance from remembering alternatives glimpsed beyond its walls. The monastic body, physical experience in spiritual context. While medieval monastic life centered on spiritual concerns, it remained fundamentally embodied experience. The physical realities of monastic existence, controlled diet, disrupted sleep, sexual abstinence, limited comfort, regulated movement, and ritualized gestures, created a distinctive corporeal psychology that shaped both individual experience and institutional function. 2 weeks have passed since the market excursion, and winter has deepened its grip on the monastery. Your body registers this seasonal progression through multiple physical challenges. The perpetual cold that penetrates stone walls and woolen habits, creating constant low-grade discomfort. The increasingly monotonous diet as fresh foods disappear until spring. The heightened effort required for basic tasks when fingers grow stiff and extremities numb from inadequate heating. The monastic approach to these physical discomforts reveals much about medieval understanding of body-mind relationships. Rather than merely tolerating these hardships as unfortunate necessities, monastic psychology deliberately incorporated physical challenges into spiritual practice through a process modern researchers might call reframing, interpreting bodily experiences within meaningful frameworks that transformed their psychological impact. The 11th century monk John of Fécamp provided a classic example of this reframing in his meditation guide, instructing monks to consider how each discomfort of the flesh creates opportunity for spiritual victory. Cold becomes not merely environmental hardship, but occasion for contemplating Christ's nakedness during crucifixion. Hunger becomes intentional solidarity with biblical fasting. Physical pain becomes participation in redemptive suffering. Through these interpretive frameworks, otherwise meaningless physical distress gains purpose and significance. This morning, your left foot throbs from chilblains, painful inflammation caused by exposure to cold followed by rapid warming, common in unheated medieval buildings. As you stand for the extended morning prayers, the discomfort becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The monastic solution isn't to seek immediate relief, but to consciously incorporate this sensation into your spiritual practice, silently offering each wave of pain as sacrificial participation in Christ's suffering. This approach to physical discomfort represents what contemporary psychologists might call pain reprocessing, altering the emotional and cognitive components of pain experience without necessarily changing its sensory aspects. Modern research confirms the effectiveness of meaning-based interventions for pain management, suggesting that the monastic approach to physical suffering contained genuine psychological insight despite its theological framing. Beyond passive acceptance of environmental hardships, monasticism actively employed physical experience as spiritual technology through deliberate ascetic practices. These ranged from universal disciplines like fasting and night vigils to more extreme individual practices like wearing hair shirts, self-flagellation, or prolonged uncomfortable postures during prayer. Historical evidence suggests wide variation in ascetic intensity across different monastic communities and time periods. Reform movements regularly emerged criticizing either excessive physical mortification or insufficient bodily discipline, revealing ongoing tension about the proper relationship between physical discomfort and spiritual development. The Cistercian reform of the 12th century, for instance, criticized Cluniac Benedictines for excessive comfort and food consumption, while later observers sometimes condemned Cistercian extremes of bodily deprivation. Your own monastery maintains moderate ascetic practices by medieval standards. Regular fasting occurs on Wednesdays and Fridays, plus extended periods during Advent and Lent, reducing intake to a single modest meal on designated days. Sleep disruption through night offices remains constant year-round. Physical comfort is minimized through hard sleeping surfaces, minimal heating, and simple clothing regardless of weather. These practices are considered normal and necessary, rather than exceptionally harsh within your religious context. The psychological impact of these physical regimens worked through multiple mechanisms. Most obviously, they created shared physical experiences that reinforced community identity. Every brother feeling the same hunger during fasts, the same fatigue during night offices, the same cold during winter prayers. This physical synchronization contributed to psychological alignment, creating what anthropologists would later call communitas through shared bodily states. More subtly, controlled physical deprivation served what modern psychology would recognize as attention direction and cognitive regulation functions. Hunger, fatigue, and discomfort demand attentional resources, potentially reducing capacity for certain types of unwanted thoughts. Several medieval monastic writers explicitly acknowledged this effect, noting that moderate physical hardship could diminish sexual thoughts or worldly preoccupations by redirecting cognitive focus to immediate bodily states. The 12th century monk Richard of Saint Victor advised that when lustful thoughts assail you, increase your fasting until bodily hunger consumes the mind's wandering fires. This sophisticated understanding of how physical states could modify cognitive processes reveals medieval monastic psychology's practical insights, despite its pre-scientific theoretical framework. Not all physical aspects of monastic life involved deprivation. The choreographed movements of liturgical practice, specific gestures, postures, and processions performed identically by all participants, created embodied experiences that shaped psychological states through what contemporary research would identify as bidirectional body-mind influence. During today's Mass, you perform these ritualized movements with practiced precision, kneeling at designated phrases, making the sign of the cross at specified moments, bowing toward the altar at particular transitions, processing information during the gospel reading. These physical actions aren't merely symbolic but psychologically active, creating embodied engagement that shapes attention, emotion, and cognitive focus through muscular patterns and proprioceptive feedback. Modern empirical research confirms what monastic practice intuitively understood, that physical postures and movements influence psychological states through multiple neurobiological pathways. The prostration position used during certain monastic prayers demonstrably affects autonomic nervous system function, potentially inducing parasympathetic dominance associated with calm attention. The synchronized movements of communal ritual have been shown to increase interpersonal bonding through coordinated motor activity and associated neurohormonal changes. The monastic body also experienced distinctive regulation of foundational physical functions like eating, sleeping, and sexuality. These basic biological processes became sites of institutional management and spiritual meaning-making, creating unique psychological relationships with fundamental human needs and drives. Food practices extended beyond simple restriction to elaborate symbolic systems. Different foods carried specific spiritual associations, particular ingredients prohibited during penitential seasons, others reserved for feast days, some associated with specific saints or liturgical meanings. The 14th century customary from Durham Cathedral Priory specified different bread qualities for different ranks and occasions, with precisely detailed regulations for when specific food types could be consumed and by whom. These elaborate food rules created what anthropologists would later identify as culinary grammar, a system of meaningful distinctions that transformed physical consumption into symbolic communication. By controlling not just quantity but categories and combinations of food, monastic regulations constructed an embodied symbolic language that reinforced institutional values through daily physical practice. Sleep regulation functioned similarly, with elaborate rules governing not just timing but bodily position, permitted coverings, preparation rituals, and even appropriate mental content while falling asleep. The Cluniac customaries specified that monks must sleep partially clothed, with hands outside the covers, never lying on their stomachs, positions believed to minimize potential for nocturnal emissions or inappropriate physical pleasure. The comprehensive management of sexual expression represented perhaps the most psychologically significant aspect of monastic bodily regulation. Beyond the obvious prohibition of sexual activity, monastic rules attempted to regulate even internal physical responses through environmental controls, cognitive techniques, and spiritual frameworks that reconceptualized sexual energy as spiritual capacity. Your own experience of these sexual regulations likely varies based on individual temperament, age, previous life experience, and personal spirituality. Historical evidence suggests enormous variation in how individual monks experienced celibacy requirements, some reporting minimal difficulty after initial adjustment, others documenting lifelong struggles with sexual thoughts and impulses, and many falling somewhere between these extremes with periodic challenges managed through established spiritual techniques. The medieval monastic framework conceptualized sexual abstinence not as mere prohibition, but as energy redirection. The 12th century Cistercian author of The Soul's Affection for God explicitly described sexual energy as the same force that, properly channeled, becomes the soul's passion for divine union. This transformation model provided psychological framework for understanding celibacy as redirection rather than simple suppression, a conceptual approach with potential psychological advantages over mere prohibition. As evening approaches and your body registers the accumulated physical experiences of the day, the mornings standing with painful chilblains, the hunger of today's fast, the muscular patterns of ritual movement, the perpetual cold that has become background sensation. You prepare for Compline with awareness of how completely the monastic system has engaged your physical existence in service of its spiritual aims. This holistic integration of physical experience into spiritual framework represents one of medieval monasticism's most psychologically sophisticated aspects. Rather than attempting to transcend embodiment through pure intellectualism, the monastic system acknowledged physical reality as both challenge and opportunity, developing nuanced approaches to incorporating bodily experience into spiritual practice through meaningful, interpretive frameworks. The bell sounds for Compline, calling you once more to physical enactment of spiritual commitment. Your body, trained through years of identical movements, responds almost automatically to its familiar summons. In this moment of transition, physical habit and spiritual meaning become indistinguishable, the embodied reality of monastic psychology made visible in motion toward communal prayer, creativity within constraint, intellectual life behind walls. The intellectual dimension of medieval monastic life contradicts many popular assumptions about the period. Far from being solely focused on rote prayer and manual labor, monasteries functioned as the primary centers of learning, textual preservation, and knowledge development throughout much of the medieval period. This vibrant intellectual tradition existed within strict parameters that created a distinctive cognitive environment, simultaneously limited and liberating, constrained and creative. 2 days have passed since you completed your astronomical calculations, and today's schedule includes afternoon time in the scriptorium. As you take your assigned place at the writing desk, you're given today's task, copying portions of Augustine's commentary on the Psalms, a relatively straightforward assignment compared to more complex theological or illustrated works. The physical and sensory environment of the scriptorium reveals much about monastic intellectual culture. The room maintains strict silence, with necessary communication conducted through the established sign language. Natural light from high windows is carefully managed to illuminate work surfaces without creating distracting shadows or glare. The furniture, specially designed writing desks with angled surfaces, represents ergonomic understanding developed through centuries of textual production. Within this carefully controlled environment, you begin the meticulous work of textual reproduction. Each letter requires deliberate formation according to the house style, the particular script variation used in your monastery that identifies manuscripts with your community. This is not mechanical copying, but embodied participation in textual tradition, requiring constant attention to multiple dimensions: letter formation, word spacing, line alignment, ink consistency, and faithful reproduction of the exemplar, the original text being copied. The psychological state required for this work combines focused attention with bodily discipline and surrender of creative impulse, the perfect alignment of mind, hand, and rule that characterized monastic intellectual activity. Early monastic writers compared this state to meditation, noting how the rhythmic, physical activity of writing created conditions for particular forms of attention where intellect and body worked in coordinated harmony. This state represents what modern psychology might call flow, optimal psychological engagement characterized by absorption in skilled activity at the edge of capability. The conditions of the scriptorium deliberately fostered this state through environmental management, clear parameters, and the balance of challenge and skill that contemporary research identifies as crucial for flow experiences. Your experience copying Augustine reflects this distinctive cognitive environment. Hours pass with peculiar subjective speed as attention narrows to the immediate tasks of text reproduction, the silence, the physical alignment of body to writing position, the regulated breathing that naturally accompanies careful penmanship. All create conditions for particular forms of consciousness, neither fully active nor passive, but receptively engaged with textual transmission. This scribal work represents only one aspect of monastic intellectual life. Beyond mere copying, monasteries engaged in textual study, commentary, compilation, and original composition within carefully defined parameters. The distinctive feature of this intellectual culture was productive constraint, creativity expressed not through unlimited originality, but through recombination, elaboration, and interpretation within traditional frameworks. Historical evidence shows remarkable intellectual diversity within these constraints. The 12th century Benedictine Rupert of Deutz produced innovative biblical interpretations while remaining within orthodox boundaries. The 11th century monk Hermann of Reichenau developed new mathematical concepts while working within the established framework of computus, calendar calculation. The Benedictine abbess Hildegard of Bingen created original theological visions and music compositions while maintaining institutional approval through careful presentation within traditional forms. These historical figures demonstrate how monastic intellectual life functioned through what might be called constrained creativity, innovation occurring not despite limitations, but through productive engagement with them. The boundaries of orthodox thought, the requirements of traditional textual forms, and the established methods of argumentation created intellectual frameworks within which substantial creativity remained possible. Your own experience as a monk likely includes both scribal reproduction and some level of intellectual engagement appropriate to your abilities and monastery's emphasis. Historical records show that monastic communities differentiated roles based on individual capabilities, with some brothers primarily engaged in manual tasks, while others specialized in intellectual work according to talent and training. The rule of Saint Benedict explicitly acknowledges this diversity, instructing that assignments should consider individual strengths and weaknesses. This pragmatic approach created unofficial intellectual hierarchies within nominally egalitarian communities. Monastery records frequently distinguish between simple brothers who participated primarily in physical labor and prayer, and more educated monks who engaged in textual production, teaching, and theological discussion. Your personal intellectual engagement extends beyond today's copying task to include your private astronomical calculations and regular participation in the Lectio Divina practice. The distinctive monastic approach to textual engagement that combined reading, meditation, prayer, and contemplation. This multi-level textual practice represented a sophisticated cognitive technology for developing particular forms of attention and understanding. The Lectio Divina began with slow, often vocalized reading of sacred text, progressed through meditation on specific passages, incorporated prayer responding to the text, and ideally culminated in contemplative experience, transcending normal cognitive categories. This progressive sequence trained distinctive attentional patterns that modern cognitive science might describe as sequential engagement of different neural networks, analytical, associative, emotional, and default mode systems activated in structured progression. As you complete your assigned copying for the day, Brother Michael, the Armarius library keeper, approaches with unusual discretion. He places a small text beside your work, a recently acquired astronomical treatise from the Arabic tradition, translated into Latin by scholars in Toledo. You might find this of interest during your private reading time, he murmurs before moving away. It contains observations of planetary conjunctions that complement your own calculations. This small interaction reveals another aspect of monastic intellectual life, the informal knowledge networks that existed alongside official structures. Despite theoretical uniformity, historical evidence shows that particular monks with shared intellectual interests often formed unofficial study communities, exchanging texts and ideas through networks that could extend between different monasteries through letter correspondence and occasional visits. These intellectual micro-communities appear repeatedly in historical records across different orders and time periods. The 9th century monks of St. Gall exchanged astronomical observations with counterparts at Reichenau, despite belonging to different houses. The 12th century School of St. Victor in Paris developed distinctive approaches to scriptural interpretation through collaborative work among like-minded canons regular. The Benedictines of 10th century England maintained active textual exchange between monasteries at Winchester, Worcester, and Canterbury, creating a shared intellectual tradition despite institutional separation. Brother Michael's discreet sharing of the astronomical text places you within this long tradition of intellectual networking within monastic constraints. His awareness of your astronomical interests, technically permissible but potentially raising questions about divided attention, demonstrates how individual intellectual pursuits could be accommodated and even supported within the broader institutional framework through informal networks based on recognized ability and shared interests. You carefully place the astronomical treatise within your personal effects to examine during evening reading time, experiencing the distinctive mixture of intellectual excitement and cautious discretion that characterized monastic scholarly life. The text represents both opportunity for genuine learning and potential risk if your enthusiasm for astronomical calculation were perceived as excessive attachment to secular knowledge rather than proper religious study. This tension between intellectual curiosity and spiritual priorities defined monastic cognitive life. The historical evidence shows monastic authorities constantly negotiating between encouraging necessary learning and containing potentially problematic intellectual directions. The 12th century Cistercian statutes specifically warned against curiosity that distracts from contemplation, while simultaneously establishing schools for training monks in necessary theological knowledge. The 9th century monastic regulations from Benedict of Aniane distinguished between useful learning that serves divine understanding and vain knowledge pursued for its own glory. The evening reading period arrives after Vespers, providing a rare interval of relative intellectual autonomy within the regulated day. In your cell, you examine the Arabic astronomical treatise, finding observations of planetary conjunctions that indeed complement your own calculations. The text describes mathematical methods for predicting celestial positions with greater precision than your current approach, representing genuine advancement in astronomical understanding. Your response to this text demonstrates the nuanced reality of monastic intellectual engagement. You begin by framing the study within legitimate religious purpose. Better celestial calculations improve the accuracy of liturgical calendar determination, a recognized ecclesiastical need. This framing represents not mere rationalization, but the genuine integration of intellectual and spiritual purposes characteristic of medieval monastic thought, where secular knowledge found legitimate place through connection to religious function. At the same time, your engagement with the astronomical content transcends purely practical application, reflecting authentic intellectual curiosity. The careful planetary observations, the elegant mathematical solutions, and the systematic methodology evident in the Arabic text appeal to cognitive values not reducible to religious utility. Your appreciation engages what modern philosophy of science would recognize as intellectual virtues: precision, explanatory power, systematic coherence, that operate somewhat independently from religious frameworks while remaining compatible with them. This complex integration of religious purpose and genuine intellectual engagement characterized the most sophisticated aspects of monastic scholarly tradition. The great monastic intellectuals, figures like Bede, Alcuin, Hildegard, Hugh of St. Victor, and others, consistently demonstrated this dual motivation, simultaneously serving religious purposes and pursuing knowledge with authentic scholarly commitment. Historical evidence suggests this intellectual ecosystem produced distinctive cognitive adaptations within medieval monastic culture. The combination of strict textual constraints with encouragement of certain forms of intellectual elaboration created what historian Jean Leclerc called a love of learning and desire for God that characterized the finest monastic scholarship. This approach differed significantly from both earlier classical traditions of open philosophical inquiry and later scholastic methods of logical disputation. Monastic intellectual life operated through what might be called constrained creativity, originality expressed not through rejection of tradition, but through elaboration, synthesis, and adaptation within traditional boundaries. Innovation occurred through established patterns like commentary, developing extended interpretation of authoritative texts, florilegia, collecting and arranging excerpts to create new contextual meanings, and adaptation, applying established principles to new questions or circumstances. As you study the astronomical treatise, incorporating its insights into your own calculations, you participate in this distinctive cognitive tradition. Your work doesn't claim revolutionary originality, but builds incrementally on existing knowledge while remaining within acceptable boundaries of monastic intellectual life. This balance, finding intellectual freedom within constraint rather than through rejection of limits, defined the psychological experience of monastic scholarly engagement. The the bell sounds for Compline, requiring you to set aside the astronomical text and rejoin the community for the day's final prayers. This constant alternation between individual intellectual pursuit and communal liturgical practice created the rhythmic oscillation characteristic of monastic cognitive life, movement between focused academic attention and embodied ritual participation that contemporary cognitive science might describe as engagement of different attentional networks and states of consciousness. This intellectual environment produced some of medieval Europe's most significant scholarly and cultural contributions. Monastic scriptoria preserved classical texts that would otherwise have disappeared entirely during political instability. Benedictine scholars developed innovative historical methods through chronicle keeping and textual analysis. Monastery schools created educational approaches that eventually evolved into university systems. Monastic artists and musicians produced revolutionary developments in representational art and musical notation. These achievements emerged not despite monastic restrictions, but through the distinctive cognitive environment these constraints created. The combination of enforced stability, allowing long-term intellectual projects impossible in more disrupted environments, institutional continuity, enabling multi-generational scholarly efforts, material support, providing necessary resources without competitive economic demands, and intellectual frameworks, offering clear parameters that facilitated certain forms of creativity while limiting others, produced unique conditions for particular kinds of intellectual development. Your personal experience within this system reflects both its limitations and possibilities. The astronomical calculations represent intellectual activity, constrained by institutional parameters, yet containing genuine creativity and connection to broader knowledge traditions. The careful negotiation required, maintaining balance between legitimate learning and potentially excessive curiosity, created distinctive cognitive habits, characteristic of monastic intellectual life. As you prepare for night prayers, you carefully store the astronomical treatise in your small wooden chest, covering it with permitted devotional texts in case of unexpected inspection. This small act of protective discretion reflects the complex reality of monastic intellectual life. Neither the completely regimented conformity depicted in some modern portrayals, nor the unfettered scholarly freedom sometimes romantically imagined, but a sophisticated negotiation of creativity within constraint that produced its own distinctive forms of knowledge and understanding. The seasons of monastic life. Time's cycle and progression. The passage of time in medieval monasteries operated through multiple overlapping cycles, daily, weekly, seasonal, and annual, creating a complex temporal experience fundamentally different from modern linear time perception. This distinctive temporality shaped monastic psychology through both the security of predictable repetition and the meaningful variation within cyclical patterns. Spring has arrived after the long winter, bringing transformation to both landscape and monastic routine. The morning air entering your cell carries new scents, damp earth, growing things, subtle floral notes that penetrate even the monastery's stone walls. The dawn light arrives noticeably earlier, changing the experience of rising for matins from the profound darkness of winter to emerging twilight that affects both practical function and psychological disposition. This seasonal transition impacts monastic life at multiple levels. Practically, work assignments shift from indoor winter occupations to garden preparation, field cultivation, and maintenance tasks delayed during colder months. Liturgically, the approach of Easter brings distinctive prayers, chants, and ritual observances that differ from the recently completed Lenten practices. Physically, the warming temperatures and increased daylight alter bodily experiences of cold, fatigue, and sensory engagement with the environment. The monastery's temporal organization accommodated these seasonal variations, while maintaining fundamental structural consistency. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically prescribed seasonal adjustments to the daily schedule, acknowledging that human needs changed with natural conditions. The Winter Horarium, daily schedule, arranged the 8 daily prayer offices to maximize daylight use during shortened days, while the summer schedule spread them differently across longer daylight periods. These seasonal adjustments represented practical adaptation within stable overall structure. This morning, you rise for matins according to the summer schedule, slightly later than winter's earliest darkness, but still long before ordinary working people would begin their day. The transition period between seasonal schedules created minor disruptions to established patterns, requiring conscious adjustment after months of identical timing. Several brothers appear slightly disoriented by the change, arriving moments late to prayer positions or hesitating during familiar liturgical sequences newly adjusted for the season. These seasonal transitions reveal how deeply the monastic temporal system shaped psychological experience. After months of identical scheduling, even minor adjustments created noticeable cognitive effects. Brief confusion in automatic processes, heightened attention to procedures normally performed through habit, conscious recalculation of time intervals between activities. These effects demonstrate how thoroughly the monastic temporal regime had been internalized, creating cognitive and behavioral patterns that operated below conscious awareness until disrupted. Beyond daily scheduling, seasonal progression significantly affected monastic diet, creating another cycle of variation within established parameters. The spring abundance of fresh greens, early vegetables, and dairy products following the resumption of milk production after winter calving represented significant sensory and nutritional change after winter's preserved foods. Today's midday meal includes fresh sorrel soup and newly harvested radishes. Simple fare, but bringing vibrant flavors and nutrients absent during colder months. Historical records from monastery kitchens document these seasonal dietary patterns. The 14th century account books from Westminster Abbey show dramatic increases in fresh vegetable purchases during spring months. The 13th century customary from Aynsham Abbey specifically mentions adjusting portion sizes seasonally, acknowledging greater nutritional needs during intensive agricultural work periods. The Cistercian regulations permitted certain dietary accommodations during harvest when physical labor demands peaked. These variations created what anthropologists would call temporal landmarks within the monastic year, distinctive periods marked by significant changes in daily experience that helped differentiate otherwise similar days within cyclical time. Such differentiation addressed a fundamental psychological challenge of highly repetitive environments, maintaining temporal orientation and preventing the perceptual blur that occurs when days lack distinguishing features. The liturgical calendar provided the most elaborated system of temporal differentiation, overlaying natural seasonal progression with religious meaning through feast days, saints' commemorations, and major seasonal observances. Today marks the feast of Saint Benedict himself, bringing special prayers, readings from his life, and modest celebration through augmented meals and reduced work assignments. Such feast days punctuated monastic temporal experience, creating meaningful variation within structural continuity. This combination of stability and variation created a distinctive temporal psychology. The fundamental cycles remained consistent year after year. The same major feasts, the same seasonal transitions, the same liturgical progressions. Yet within these cycles, the specific manifestations varied enough to prevent complete monotony. The Easter date shifted annually based on lunar calculations. Weather patterns affected agricultural timing. Particular saints' days gained or lost prominence depending on local events or institutional developments. Your own experience of this temporal system reflects both its constraints and psychological benefits. After 15 years in the monastery, you've completed the same annual cycle 15 times, creating deep familiarity with its its patterns. Yet each year brings subtle differences in your experience. Different work assignments as you've gained seniority, shifting perspectives on familiar texts through accumulated understanding. New brothers joining the community while others have died, changing relationships to the physical demands as your body ages. This afternoon, you join brothers working in the herb garden, preparing soil and planting medicinal herbs that will supply the infirmary throughout the coming year. The physical sensations, hands in warming soil, spring sunlight on your face after winter's confinement. The scent of crushed herbs as plants are positioned create powerful temporal markers connecting to similar experiences in previous springs, while containing their own distinct qualities in this particular year. The monastic temporal experience also incorporated longer developmental cycles beyond seasonal variation. Despite theoretical commitment to stability and consistency, monastic life recognized progression through different life stages and community roles. Most brothers entered the monastery as novices, often in their teens or early 20s, underwent a structured period of formation and training, professed solemn vows, and then advanced through various responsibilities as they aged and demonstrated particular capabilities. Your own position reflects this progression. Having entered the monastery at 17, you experienced the intense formation period of novitiate, with its focus on basic discipline and conformity to communal practice. The subsequent years brought gradual increases in responsibility and trust, from closely supervised work assignments to more independent roles, from silence during community discussions to occasional invitation to share perspectives. Now, in your early 30s, you occupy a middle position in the community hierarchy, no longer among the youngest brothers requiring constant guidance, not yet among the senior monks whose age and experience command particular deference. This developmental progression created another temporal dimension in monastic experience, a life course pathway that provided directional movement within the otherwise cyclical system. Historical evidence shows that this progression significantly impacted psychological experience, with different challenges and adaptations characteristic of different monastic life stages. Novices and newly professed monks typically struggled most with fundamental adaptations, adjusting to communal life, mastering complex liturgical requirements, and managing the psychological transition from secular to religious identity. The 12th century customaries from multiple Benedictine houses show elaborate systems for training and supervising novices, with particular attention to preventing the despondency that frequently accompanied initial adjustment to monastic discipline. Mid-career monks, like yourself, faced different challenges, maintaining spiritual motivation after initial fervor diminished, finding meaningful engagement within repetitive structures, and negotiating the complex social dynamics of established community membership. Historical accounts from this life stage often show increased focus on particular interests or responsibilities that provided purpose and distinction within the standardized environment. Specialized roles in manuscript production, particular liturgical offices, or specific administrative functions. Senior monks encountered the challenges of physical decline within a physically demanding lifestyle, reconciliation of youthful spiritual ideals with lived experience, and the existential questions accompanying awareness of approaching death. Records from medieval monasteries show regular accommodations for aging brothers, reduced liturgical obligations, less physically demanding work assignments, and increased medical attention, alongside cultural emphasis on the spiritual wisdom accompanying age. As you work in the herb garden, you observe these various life stages embodied in the brothers around you. Young Brother Thomas, just 6 months past his solemn profession, approaches the work with intense concentration on following instructions precisely, still consciously performing actions that more experienced monks accomplish through habitual knowledge. Elderly Brother Martin, whose 7 decades in monastic life have curved his spine and gnarled his hands, contributes through guidance rather than physical labor, his knowledge of growing conditions and plant properties representing accumulated experience impossible to record in written form. This visible progression through life stages provided another form of temporal orientation position within the cyclical system. Despite the theoretical sameness of monastic observance across the lifespan, practical reality acknowledged developmental differences while maintaining institutional continuity. This balance, honoring human developmental reality within stable structures, represented another sophisticated adaptation within the monastic temporal system. The bell sounds for Vespers, drawing you from garden work to evening prayer. The transition feels different in spring's extended daylight compared to winter's early darkness, less a movement from work to enclosed prayer than a temporary interruption of outdoor activity that will resume briefly before day's end. This subtle shift in temporal perception demonstrates how natural cycles continued to influence monastic experience, despite elaborate cultural structuring of time. As you take your place for Vespers, the familiar psalms and responses connect today's experience to countless previous spring evenings, creating the distinctive temporal consciousness that characterized monastic psychology, simultaneously present in immediate experience, connected to similar moments across previous years, and oriented toward the identical observances that will continue into future years and beyond individual lifespans. This temporal orientation, balancing immediate presence with extended continuity, created one of the most distinctive features of monastic psychological experience. Spiritual experiences, the inner life of medieval monks, beyond the visible aspects of monastic routine, the liturgical performances, physical labors, and communal interactions. Medieval monasticism centered on interior spiritual experiences that resist simple historical documentation, yet fundamentally shaped monastic psychology. These experiences ranged from quiet moments of perceived divine connection to dramatic mystical states, creating a complex spectrum of religious consciousness cultivated through specific practices and interpretive frameworks. Tonight marks the beginning of a 3-day personal retreat granted by the abbot in recognition of the anniversary of your profession, the formal commitment that made you a full member of the monastic community 15 years ago. This brief period of intensified spiritual focus represents a small departure from communal rhythms, though you'll still attend major liturgical offices while being excused from regular work assignments and permitted additional time for private prayer and reading. You enter the small anchor hold, a prayer cell attached to the church specifically designed for periods of intensified spiritual practice. Unlike your sleeping cell, this space contains only a prayer stool, a simple wooden cross, and a single candle. Its stone walls, thick and windowless except for a small opening facing the church altar, create a sensory environment of reduced stimulation, minimal light, dampened sound, unchanging visual feel. Conditions repeatedly associated with altered states of consciousness across religious traditions. This environmental management represents one aspect of monastic spiritual technology, deliberate creation of physical conditions conducive to particular psychological states. The historical record shows a sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors influenced interior experience, with monastic authorities regulating everything from lighting to acoustic properties in spaces designed for spiritual practice. As your eyes adjust to the dim anchor hold, you begin the spiritual exercises planned for this retreat, a systematic meditation on Christ's passion, suffering, and death, following the detailed visualization method taught by the monastery's novice master. This practice begins with rhythmic breathing and bodily stillness, then progresses through sequential visualization of specific scenes from biblical accounts of the crucifixion, incorporating emotional engagement with each image through identification with various participants in the narrative. This visualization practice represents a central element of medieval monastic spirituality, particularly developed in the later medieval period. Instructional texts like the 13th century Meditationes Vitae Christi provided detailed guidance for constructing mental images with multisensory detail, not merely seeing but imaginatively hearing, touching, smelling, and tasting elements of the biblical scenes. This sophisticated use of guided imagery anticipated by centuries what contemporary psychology would eventually identify as a powerful technique for attention regulation concentration, and emotional modulation. Your initial attempts to construct these visualizations meet the common challenges documented in monastic spiritual journals: wandering attention, intrusive thoughts, and the fluctuating clarity of mental imagery. The practice requires continuous redirection of attention, returning awareness to the visualization whenever you notice distraction. This attention training represents another core element of monastic spiritual technology, creating cognitive skills that modern contemplative neuroscience identifies as central to meditative development across traditions. After approximately an hour of this structured practice, your experience begins to shift in ways familiar from previous retreats, yet always somewhat unpredictable. The initially effortful visualization becomes more self-sustaining, requiring less conscious management. The boundary between deliberately constructed imagery and seemingly spontaneous elaboration becomes less distinct. Emotional engagement intensifies beyond voluntary control, creating powerful feelings of compassion, grief, and devotion that seem to arise independently of deliberate generation. These shifts represent what medieval monastic writers called the transition from meditation to contemplation, from active, directed spiritual practice to more receptive states characterized by reduced sense of effortful control and increased impression of direct spiritual perception. The 12th century Cistercian William of Saint-Thierry described this transition as moving from laboring with the mind to resting in the heart, while the 14th century English text, The Cloud of Unknowing, compared it to the difference between spiritual workmanship and spiritual receiving. Historical accounts of monastic spiritual experience describe enormous variation in how individual monks experienced these contemplative states. Some reported primarily emotional manifestations, intense feelings of divine love, profound grief over human sinfulness, overwhelming gratitude for perceived divine mercy. Others emphasized cognitive aspects, sudden understanding of theological concepts, integration of previously disparate scriptural passages, or insights into personal spiritual development. Still, others described perceptual alterations, visual or auditory experiences interpreted as divine communication, sensations of presence beyond ordinary awareness, or dramatic shifts in body perception, including weightlessness or unusual warmth. Your own experience this evening includes both emotional and perceptual elements. The visualization of Christ's suffering generates intense compassion that eventually transcends the specific imagery, becoming a generalized emotional state that feels qualitatively different from ordinary emotion, both more intense and more stable, less reactive and more encompassing. Simultaneously, you experience subtle perceptual alterations. The small anchor hold seems to expand beyond its physical dimensions. The boundary between your body and the surrounding space becomes less defined, and the single candle flame occasionally appears to pulse with unusual brightness. These phenomenological features match descriptions in numerous medieval monastic accounts of contemplative experience. The 12th century Cistercian Adam of Persane described similar spatial alterations during prayer. The cell grows vast as heaven, its walls no longer stone, but boundless light. The 13th century Dominican Henry Suso reported comparable visual phenomena with candle flames appearing unusually radiant during contemplative states. The English mystic Richard Rolle detailed similar experiences of unusual bodily warmth and boundary dissolution during his private devotions. The monastic interpretive framework provided specific understanding for these experiences, distinguishing between ordinary psychological phenomena, genuine spiritual states, potential demonic deceptions, and simple physical factors affecting perception. The 14th century spiritual manual, The Ladder of Monks, warned that physical exhaustion may create sensations resembling spiritual visitation, while the 12th century guide on the formation of novices cautioned that the enemy devil may generate counterfeit sweetness in prayer to foster spiritual pride. This sophisticated phenomenological discrimination created a nuanced approach to contemplative experience, neither dismissing altered states as merely psychological nor accepting all unusual perceptions as authentically spiritual. Instead, monastic spiritual directors developed detailed criteria for discernment based on centuries of collective experience with contemplative states and their varied effects on practitioners. As your retreat continues through the night hours, the contemplative state gradually shifts again, moving from initial intensity toward quieter awareness, characterized by reduced mental activity and simplified attention. This progression follows the patterns described in numerous monastic sources, with the 13th century Franciscan Bonaventure detailing a similar sequence from active engagement through emotional intensity to what he called mental excess, a state beyond ordinary conceptual thinking characterized by unified awareness. The psychological significance of these contemplative states extended beyond the immediate experience to their integration with broader monastic life. Historical evidence suggests they served multiple functions in the monastic psychological ecosystem, providing emotional compensation for physical austerities, creating rewarding experiences that reinforced adherence to demanding practices, offering psychological rest from the continuous self-monitoring required by monastic regulations, and generating interpretive material that enriched engagement with spiritual texts and liturgical performances. Your own retreat experience demonstrates this integration as dawn approaches. The contemplative immersion of the night gradually transitions toward more ordinary consciousness, but carries perceptual and emotional residue that influences how you experience the morning liturgy. The familiar prayers and chants take on enhanced significance, with previously unremarkable phrases suddenly revealing new dimensions of meaning. The physical sensations of kneeling, standing, and processing through the church connect to the embodied aspects of the night's contemplative states, creating experiential bridges between formal observance and interior spirituality. This integration between contemplative experience and daily practice represented a central feature of monastic spiritual psychology. Unlike some religious traditions that sharply distinguished between ordinary observance and mystical states, medieval monasticism developed sophisticated approaches for connecting these dimensions, creating what the historian of spirituality Bernard McGinn called mysticism as process rather than merely peak experience. As you complete morning prayers and return to the anchor hold to continue your retreat, you carry this integrative awareness, neither fully immersed in contemplative states nor entirely returned to ordinary functioning, but occupying the distinctive intermediate consciousness that characterized mature monastic spirituality. This middle space between extraordinary experience and routine observance created what contemporary contemplative studies might call a contemplative ecology, a sustainable relationship between peak experiences, daily practice, conceptual understanding, and community participation. The historical record shows wide variation in how individual monks navigated this contemplative dimension. Some monks reported frequent intense mystical experiences that dominated their spiritual lives, like the 12th century Cistercian Aelred of Rievos, whose autobiographical writings describe regular experiences of ecstatic prayer. Others documented more moderate contemplative development, characterized by quieter states and gradual growth, like the 14th century Carthusian Hugh of Balma, whose spiritual journal records decades of patient practice with modest but cumulative results. This variation created another dimension of individual difference within outwardly uniform monastic observance. Behind the identical habits and synchronized liturgical performances existed enormously diverse interior landscapes, with each monk experiencing unique patterns of spiritual development shaped by temperament, formation, personal history, and countless factors beyond institutional control. The monastic system attempted to accommodate this diversity simplicity while maintaining external conformity, creating what amounted to standardized frameworks for non-standardized experiences. Your second day of retreat brings different contemplative qualities than the previous night. Less emotional intensity, but greater perceptual clarity. Fewer dramatic shifts in consciousness, but more sustained attention. Less vivid imagery, but deeper sense of meaning. This variation follows patterns described in monastic sources, which recognized that spiritual experience rarely progressed linearly, but instead moved through cycles of intensity and quietude, clarity and confusion, connection and apparent absence. The 12th century Cistercian spiritual writer William of Saint-Thierry described this cyclical pattern as the soul's seasons, noting that periods of perceived spiritual presence necessarily alternated with experiences of absence that tested and deepened faith. The 14th century English text, The Cloud of Unknowing, similarly acknowledged these fluctuations. Sometimes he may feel nothing but a kind of darkness about his mind, or else a kind of clouding between him and his God. This recognition of variability created psychological resilience against the disappointment and doubt that might otherwise accompany less intense periods of spiritual practice. As your retreat concludes and you prepare to rejoin the full communal schedule, you experience the characteristic reintegration challenges documented in monastic sources. The transition from extended contemplative practice to ordinary activity creates temporary disorientation. Sensory inputs seem unusually intense after the reduced stimulation of the anchor hold. Social interactions require conscious attention after extended solitude, and the body registers surprising fatigue despite limited physical activity during the retreat period. The monastic tradition developed specific practices for managing these transitions, recognizing their psychological significance. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed gradual reintegration after periods of intensified spiritual practice, with returning monks initially excused from certain communal obligations. The 13th century customary from the Franciscan house at Munich specifically addressed post-retreat adjustment. Brothers returning from private prayer should be given space for silence and modest duties until fully restored to ordinary awareness. This attention to transitions between contemplative and active states reflected sophisticated understanding of how different forms of consciousness affected psychological functioning. Rather than treating altered states as entirely separate from ordinary awareness, the monastic approach recognized their interconnection and developed practices to manage movement between these different modes of experience. This integration created a spiritual psychology that valued both extraordinary states and their incorporation into everyday monastic life, avoiding both excessive emphasis on peak experiences and denial of their significance. As you return to your regular cell after the retreat's conclusion, you carry this integrated awareness, neither clinging to the retreat's contemplative states nor dismissing them as temporary departures from real monastic life, but understanding them as concentrated expressions of the spiritual dimension permeating all aspects of the monastic vocation. This holistic perspective represents one of medieval monasticism's most sophisticated psychological insights, that extraordinary and ordinary consciousness exist not as separate categories, but as points on a continuous spectrum of human experience. The hidden transcript. Resistance and adaptation. The historical record of medieval monasticism reveals complex patterns of compliance, resistance, and adaptation beneath the surface of institutional uniformity. Behind official regulations and idealized descriptions of monastic life existed what anthropologist James Scott called the hidden transcript, the unofficial, often unrecorded reality of how individuals navigated institutional constraints through various forms of negotiation, subtle resistance, and creative adaptation. A week has passed since your personal retreat, and the full rhythm of communal life has reasserted itself in your experience. Today, you're assigned to the kitchen garden alongside 5 other brothers, weeding between rows of vegetables while maintaining the customary silence of outdoor work. The June June sun beats down with unusual intensity for this northern region, making the labor more taxing than anticipated. After nearly 2 hours, your back aches from continuous bending, and sweat soaks your heavy woolen habit unsuited to such weather. Brother Martin, the elderly monk supervising the garden work, glances around carefully before making a small but significant gesture, a subtle motion toward a nearby oak tree offering substantial shade. Without verbal communication, he indicates that you and the others should move your weeding efforts to that shaded area, despite the garden rows there requiring less immediate attention than those in direct sun. This small adjustment represents a modest form of situational resistance, not directly violating any specific rule, but quietly prioritizing physical well-being over strict work efficiency. Such minor adaptations appear constantly throughout the historical record of actual monastic practice. Customary documents frequently include prohibitions against specific behaviors that must have been common enough to require official discouragement. Monks finding excuses to work in warmer areas during winter, lingering over tasks that involved sitting rather than standing, developing minor illnesses that exempted them from particularly demanding duties, or creating unnecessary errands to town that provided brief escapes from monastic enclosure. The frequency of these prohibitions suggests a continuous process of negotiation between official requirements and practical human needs. Rather than representing simple rule-breaking or moral failure, these adaptations reveal the necessary flexibility that allowed the theoretically rigid monastic system to accommodate human limitations while maintaining institutional continuity. The 13th century Franciscan Roger Bacon acknowledged this reality when writing that some relaxation of strict observance in small matters prevents breakdown in greater ones. Your own participation in Brother Martin's subtle adjustment follows this pattern of minor adaptation. By accepting the tacit direction to work in shade, rather than requesting this accommodation directly, you maintain the appearance of perfect obedience while benefiting from practical modification. This strategy, preserving institutional forms while quietly adjusting content, characterized much of actual monastic practice beneath official descriptions of unwavering observance. The historical evidence for this negotiated reality appears in multiple sources beyond prohibitory regulations. Monastic archaeological findings frequently reveal physical adaptations that bent theoretical rules, small personal possessions hidden beneath floorboards, unofficial modifications to cells that improved comfort, and evidence of food consumption outside officially sanctioned times and places. Visitational records, official inspections of monasteries by external authorities, consistently document gaps between theoretical observance and actual practice, even in communities considered relatively strict. These adaptations operated at both individual and collective levels. Individual monks developed personal strategies for meeting basic needs within institutional constraints, techniques for improving sleep despite intentionally uncomfortable bedding, methods for moderating the effects of dietary restriction, approaches to creating small zones of privacy within constantly monitored environments. Simultaneously, communities developed collective adaptations that became unofficial but recognized modifications to official regulations, customary relaxations of particular rules during certain seasons, traditional exemptions for monks performing specific functions, or tacit understanding that certain regulations would be enforced symbolically rather than literally. After completing the garden work, you join the other brothers heading toward the lavatorium to wash before the midday meal. Here, another subtle adaptation becomes visible. The rule specifies minimal washing primarily focused on hands before eating, but over generations, your monastery has expanded this practice to include more thorough hygiene opportunities, particularly during summer months. Without explicitly contradicting the rule's emphasis on bodily mortification through limited cleanliness, the community has practically recognized the health benefits of more regular washing. This evolution represents another form of adaptation adaptation visible throughout monastic history, the gradual modification of practices through incremental changes that maintained theoretical continuity while substantively altering actual observance. The historian C.H. Lawrence documented this pattern across numerous medieval monasteries, showing how communities simultaneously proclaimed unwavering fidelity to founding regulations, while continually adjusting them to changing circumstances through interpretation rather than formal amendment. The midday meal demonstrates additional dimensions of this negotiated reality. Today, being neither a fast day nor a major feast, the refectory table holds simple but adequate food: vegetable pottage, bread, cheese, and small beer. The portions, while moderate by secular standards, are sufficient for maintaining health during physical labor. This practical adequacy represents significant moderation of the extreme dietary asceticism described in early monastic texts and still theoretically idealized in your community's spiritual literature. Historical evidence documents this gradual dietary moderation across most monastic orders. Account books from 14th century English Benedictine houses show food expenditures indicating more varied and substantial diets than early monastic ideals suggested. Archaeological evidence from monastery kitchens and waste deposits reveals consumption of foods technically permitted but more varied and nutritious than ascetic ideals would indicate. Medical texts written within monasteries increasingly emphasized adequate nutrition for maintaining health, providing theoretical justification for dietary moderation within spiritual frameworks. This pattern reflects the essential negotiation between institutional ideals and practical sustainability that characterized actual monastic life. Communities that maintained extreme physical austerities typically proved unsustainable, experiencing decline through illness, reduced recruitment, or eventual relaxation of practices. Those that developed no practical adaptations to theoretical demands often collapsed entirely or transformed beyond recognition. The most enduring monastic communities were precisely those that maintained balance between spiritual ideals and human limitations through these processes of unofficial but functional adaptation. Your personal experience of these adaptations reflects both their benefits and psychological complications. The pragmatic modifications provide necessary accommodations to human needs: protection from weather extremes, adequate nutrition for physical labor, basic hygiene for health maintenance. Yet they also create potential cognitive dissonance between official profession of unwavering observance and the daily reality of practical adjustment. Managing this gap between theory and practice constituted another psychological challenge of medieval monastic life. The monastic tradition developed sophisticated approaches to this challenge. The concept of dispensation, formal permission to modify observance under specific circumstances, created institutional recognition of necessary flexibility while maintaining theoretical integrity of the rule. The emphasis on intention, rather than literal observance in spiritual writings, provided theological framework for understanding adaptations as potentially consistent with deeper monastic purposes. The distinction between precepts, absolutely binding regulations, and counsels, aspirational ideals, in monastic literature created conceptual space for variation in practical observance. These frameworks allowed monks to navigate the inevitable gap between ideal and practice without experiencing their adaptations as simple rule-breaking or moral failure. Instead, adaptations could be understood as prudent accommodations to human limitation, temporary concessions to necessity, or practical implementations of underlying principles rather than their abandonment. This cognitive flexibility created psychological sustainability within an otherwise potentially crushing gap between theoretical demands and practical possibilities. As evening approaches and the day's work concludes, another subtle adaptation becomes visible in the cloister walkway. The rule prescribes constant spiritual focus during all activities, with minimal casual interaction between monks. Yet, as brothers move from work assignments toward Vespers, brief exchanges occur that technically comply with silence regulations while functioning as genuine social communication. Meaningful glances, small hand gestures, barely audible murmurs that communicate basic human acknowledgement beneath the formal restraints. These micro-interactions reveal another dimension of monastic adaptation, the persistence of basic human social needs, despite institutional attempts to redirect them. Historical evidence consistently shows monks finding ways to maintain essential social connections, despite regulations designed to minimize particular attachments. Letters between monks in different monasteries often contain language of friendship, officially directed toward spiritual edification, yet carrying unmistakable tones of personal affection. Necrologies, records of deceased monks, frequently include personalized remembrances that transcend generic spiritual formulas, revealing genuine bonds formed despite prohibitions against particular friendships. Your own experience includes these social adaptations: the brief nod of recognition from Brother Thomas as you pass in the cloister, the slightly extended hand contact when Brother Andrew passes you a tool in the garden, the barely perceptible smile from elderly Brother Martin, acknowledging your acceptance of his suggestion to work in shade. These minimal interactions create sustainable social connection while maintaining external compliance with regulations against particular relationships or excessive conversation. After Vespers, as you move toward the evening meal, you observe one of the more complex forms of monastic adaptation. The infirmary, monk, responsible for medical care, quietly provides elderly Brother Philip with a small package, extra food from the infirmary stores to supplement his regular meals. This technically violates regulations against individual provisions beyond communal meals, yet represents compassionate accommodation to genuine need. Brother Philip's advanced age and frailty require additional nutrition that the standard monastic diet doesn't provide, creating tension between literal rule observance and practical charity. This situation exemplifies how monastic adaptations often navigated conflicts between different institutional values. The rules simultaneously commanded strict communal equality in provisions and charitable attention to individual needs, principles that could create practical contradictions requiring negotiated resolution. Historical records show monastic communities constantly balancing these competing values through adaptations that maintained theoretical fidelity to both principles while practically prioritizing one or the other in specific situations. The 13th century customary from Westminster Abbey explicitly acknowledged this balancing act, stating that the rule binds all equally yet must be applied with discernment according to the strength and need of each brother. This differentiated application created what amounted to personalized versions of monastic observance beneath the surface appearance of absolute uniformity. Accommodations to age, health, particular abilities, and individual temperament that maintained institutional function while recognizing human variation. As night falls and you complete the day's final prayers, these various adaptations to physical conditions, bodily needs, social requirements, and individual differences reveal the complex reality beneath idealized descriptions of monastic life. Rather than representing perfect implementation of theoretical regulations, actual monastic practice involved continuous negotiation between ideal and possible, creating sustainable structures through flexibility that preserved essential purposes while accommodating human limitations. Your participation in this negotiated reality reflects neither perfect observance nor rebellious resistance, but the practical middle path that characterized most actual monastic experience. As you prepare for sleep, your slightly adjusted sleeping position to minimize discomfort from the hard mattress, the extra layer of clothing against persistent nighttime chill, and the small devotional object kept despite technical prohibitions against personal possessions, all represent the small adaptations that made the theoretical system practically sustainable despite its demanding requirements. This gap between prescriptive texts and lived reality reality didn't necessarily indicate failure of monastic ideals, but rather their realistic implementation within human limitations. The most successful monastic communities throughout medieval history were precisely those that maintained this balance, preserving essential spiritual purposes and institutional structures while allowing sufficient flexibility to accommodate human needs. Understanding this negotiated reality provides crucial perspective on how monasticism endured for centuries, despite its apparently severe demands, creating sustainable patterns of life through adaptations that historical sources reveal beneath their idealized descriptions of perfect observance. The path outward, leaving the monastery. For many monks, departure from monastic life became an eventual reality, despite the theoretical permanence of religious vows. Historical records document numerous paths outward from the cloister, some legitimate within institutional frameworks, others representing clear breaks with monastic commitment. These varied departures reveal additional dimensions of the complex relationship between institutional ideals and human reality in medieval monastic life. 20 years have passed since your profession as a monk. The monastery that once seemed an eternal, unchanging institution has revealed its own historical contingency during these decades. Political changes in the surrounding region have reduced patronage and income. Internal leadership struggles following the previous abbot's death created factions that continue to complicate communal life. Declining recruitment has left an aging population with increasing needs and fewer young brothers to meet them. These challenges reflect patterns visible across many European monasteries during certain historical periods, where external pressures and internal dynamics created institutional stress that affected individual monastic experience. This morning, you received unexpected news during chapter meeting. The abbot announced that you have been selected to join a small group of brothers establishing a dependent cell at a newly donated property 3 days' journey from the main monastery. This assignment represents one legitimate path outward from stable monastic placement, the deployment of established monks to create new foundations or revitalize dependent houses, while technically maintaining your connection to the mother house and monastic vows. This transition will fundamentally alter your daily experience and community relationships. Historical records document the psychological complexity of such transitions. The 12th century foundation records from multiple Cistercian houses describe the emotional challenges faced by monks sent from established communities to build new monasteries, the disruption of long-standing relationships, the stress of creating functional structures in unfamiliar environments, the tension between maintaining observance and addressing practical necessities. Letters between transferred monks and their original communities often express grief over separation alongside commitment to the new mission, revealing the human impact behind institutional expansion strategies. Your reaction to this assignment reflects similar complexity. After 20 years in one location, the prospect of radical change creates understandable anxiety. The established patterns that have shaped your daily existence, familiar liturgical spaces, known community dynamics, comfortable roles within the monastery's functioning, will all require reconstruction in the new setting. Simultaneously, the opportunity presents potential advantages: escape from long-standing community conflicts, increased responsibility in a smaller foundation, and renewed sense of purpose after years of routine observance. As you begin preparations for departure, scheduled for next week, you observe various reactions from community members. Some brothers express genuine sadness at your leaving, particularly those with whom you've developed closer connections despite theoretical prohibitions against particular friendships. Others display subtle satisfaction, perhaps viewing your selection as removal of perceived competition for limited positions of responsibility. The abbot himself shows the careful neutrality characteristic of administrative decisions, framing your transfer entirely in terms of institutional needs rather than personal considerations. These varied responses demonstrate the complex social reality beneath a official descriptions of monastic community. Despite theoretical commitment to universal charity without particular attachments, actual monastic communities developed intricate webs of personal affinity, rivalry, alliance, and distance. The 13th century visitation records from multiple Benedictine houses specifically address problems arising from these unofficial but powerful relational patterns. Factions forming around influential monks, preferential treatment based on personal connection rather than community need, and conflicts emerging from particular antipathies despite nominal commitments to universal brotherhood. Your eventual departure represents just one of many possible paths outward from monastic life documented in historical records. The most institutionally acceptable transitions included transfer to another house of the same order, a common occurrence typically motivated by administrative needs, conflict resolution, or balance of skills between different communities. The frequency of such transfers, documented in administrative records across various orders, contradicts the theoretical ideal of permanent stability in one location while demonstrating institutional flexibility in managing human resources. Movement to a different religious order, a more complicated transition requiring formal dispensation yet occurring regularly throughout medieval monastic history. Records show monks moving between different monastic rules, Benedictine to Cistercian, for example, or from monastic to mendicant orders, such as Benedictine to Dominican. These transitions typically required justification through greater stringency in the new order or specific skill needs that legitimized the change, despite vows of stability. Elevation to ecclesiastical office, selection of monks for positions as bishops, papal representatives, or other church offices outside the monastery. While theoretically maintaining monastic identity, such appointments effectively ended full participation in monastic life. Historical evidence shows this path most commonly available to monks from noble families, or those with particular administrative or intellectual abilities valued in broader church governance. Medical dispensation, release from full observance due to health conditions that made monastic life unsustainable. Monastery infirmary records and dispensation documents show sophisticated assessment of medical conditions that justified modified observance or, in extreme cases, return to secular life with continued spiritual supervision. These accommodations reflected realistic recognition of human physical limitations, despite theoretical lifelong commitment. Less institutionally acceptable but historically common paths included apostasy, abandonment of vows, monks who simply left their monasteries without permission or dispensation. Disciplinary records across different orders document surprisingly high rates of such departures, particularly among those who entered the monastery very young or under family pressure rather than personal vocation. Some returned after periods of wandering, undergoing penance before readmission, while others permanently exited monastic life despite technical continuing obligation to their vows. Exclaustration for misconduct, expulsion from communities for serious or repeated rule violations. While technically maintaining monastic identity and obligations, these expelled monks often effectively returned to secular living patterns despite canonical irregular status. Records show various post-expulsion trajectories, from wandering between monasteries seeking readmission to establishing independent lives as unofficial former monks with ambiguous religious status. Dispensation through external authority, release from vows through papal or episcopal intervention, typically requiring substantial political influence or financial resources. Documents from papal chanceries show these dispensations granted for various reasons, often involving noble families seeking heirs when dynastic lines faced extinction or political considerations that outweighed religious commitments. Simply disappearing. Monks who left without formal process and established new identities elsewhere, effectively vanishing from both monastic and secular records. The frequency of this path is difficult to determine precisely because successful disappearance left minimal documentation, though occasional references appear when such individuals were later discovered or voluntarily returned. The existence of these various exit paths contradicts simplistic views views of medieval monasticism as permanently binding or uniformly enforced. The historical reality shows institutional flexibility, practical challenges in maintaining lifelong commitments, and human capacity for navigating seemingly rigid systems. Understanding these dynamics provides crucial context for interpreting the lived experience of medieval monastic life beyond idealized depictions in prescriptive sources. As you pack your few possessions for the upcoming transfer, you reflect on brothers who have departed through these various paths during your 20 years in the monastery. Brother Michael, the former Armarius who shared astronomical texts with you, eventually received appointment as a bishop in a distant diocese, a promotion that recognized his scholarly abilities while effectively ending his monastic practice despite theoretical continuation of religious identity. Brother Stephen, whose psychological breakdown you witnessed years earlier, received medical dispensation to live with family members under spiritual supervision, but without full monastic obligations. Young Brother Thomas simply disappeared one night 7 years ago. His absence discovered at Matins with no subsequent information about his destination or fate. These varied departures demonstrate how monastic institutions practically accommodated human realities despite theoretical permanence of commitment. The frequency of exits and institutional mechanisms for managing them reveal sophisticated understanding of the challenges in maintaining lifelong adherence to demanding observance. Rather than indicating simple failure of monastic ideals, these accommodations represented realistic adaptation to human limitations within religious frameworks that maintained core purposes while acknowledging practical necessities. Your own transfer to the dependent cell represents one of the more institutionally integrated transitions, maintaining formal connection to your community while substantially changing your daily reality. As you prepare for departure, the practical arrangements illustrate how monastic institutions managed such transitions. Formal documentation, transferring your obedience temporarily to the prior who will lead the new foundation. Careful inventory of any books or specialized equipment you'll take for continued work, and ritualized blessing from the abbot that maintains institutional continuity despite geographical separation. The psychological experience of even this legitimate transition reveals the emotional complexity beneath institutional arrangements. Despite 20 years of training and detachment from places and particular relationships, you feel genuine grief at leaving the physical spaces that have shaped your spiritual experience. The specific acoustics of the church where countless prayer offices established your interior rhythms, the familiar pathways through cloister and grounds that supported contemplative walking, the cell whose very limitations became strange comfort through long habituation. These attachments, rarely acknowledged in official monastic discourse yet evident in personal writings from medieval monks, demonstrate the inevitable human connections formed even within systems designed to minimize particular attachments. On your final evening before departure, several brothers find ways to acknowledge the transition despite regulations limiting emotional expression or particular relationships. Brother Andrew leaves a small carved wooden cross at your cell door, ostensibly for use in the new foundation, but clearly a personal gift marking your connection. During work period, elderly Brother Martin shares stories about previous foundations established from your monastery, creating historical continuity that places your transition within meaningful tradition. Even the abbot, normally careful to maintain institutional perspective, grants brief private audience where he acknowledges your contributions to the community's intellectual life alongside formal instructions for the new assignment. These small gestures reveal the human relationships existing beneath institutional structures, connections formed despite official emphasis on universal rather than particular charity. Historical evidence shows similar patterns throughout medieval monasticism, with personal letters, gift exchanges, and private remembrances documenting the emotional bonds that developed despite theoretical prohibitions against special attachments. These connections represent another dimension of adaptation within the monastic system, the persistence of basic human relational needs finding expression through channels that maintained external compliance with regulations while satisfying fundamental social requirements. As dawn arrives on your departure departure day, you join the community for one final matin service in the familiar church where you've prayed approximately 7,300 times over 20 years. The liturgy, theoretically, remains identical to all previous occurrences, yet subjective experience transforms it through awareness of impending separation. This phenomenological difference, identical content experienced through different psychological frame, exemplifies how interior experience consistently transcended external uniformity throughout monastic history, creating unique subjective realities within standardized observance. Following morning prayers and a simple meal, you join the small group designated for the new foundation. The departure ritual balances institutional continuity with acknowledgement of significant transition, formal blessing from the abbot, presentation of official documents establishing the dependent cell's relationship to the mother house, and symbolic objects connecting the new foundation to established tradition. The community forms processional lines from church door to monastery gate, creating ceremonial corridor through which your group passes from enclosed to external space. This threshold crossing represents more than physical departure. Despite plans for the dependent cell to maintain identical observance, the practical realities of new foundation inevitably create adaptation and modification. Historical records from monastery foundations consistently show development of local variations despite theoretical uniformity, adjustments to architectural possibilities in different settings, modifications to work schedules based on regional agricultural conditions, and gradual emergence of distinctive practices shaped by specific membership and environmental factors. Your journey away from the monastery, physically moving through landscape toward new placement while remaining technically within monastic structure, creates appropriate metaphor for understanding the complex reality of medieval monastic life revealed through historical evidence. Despite theoretical permanence, uniformity, and stability, actual monastic experience involved continuous movement, institutional adaptations to changing circumstances, individual adjustments to aging and development, and dynamic negotiation between ideal expectations and human possibilities. This ongoing negotiation between structure and adaptation, permanence and change, ideal and practice created the distinctive reality of medieval monastic life beyond both romantic idealization and simplistic critique. Understanding this complex middle ground between extremes provides essential perspective on how an apparently rigid institution sustained itself for centuries, while accommodating the inevitable limitations, needs, and capacities of its human participants. Your own transition to the dependent cell represents just one manifestation of this fundamental dynamic that defined monastic experience throughout the medieval period. The legacy of monastic psychology. What modern minds can learn. The psychological practices and adaptations developed over centuries of monastic experience offer relevant insights for contemporary understanding of attention, purpose, routine, isolation, and structured community. These medieval technologies for managing the mind under challenging conditions contain surprising relevance for modern contexts, ranging from digital distraction to pandemic isolation to secular community design. Your journey from the mother house to the new foundation takes 3 days, traveling through varied landscapes that provoke reflection on your 20 years of monastic experience. As the small group makes its way along medieval roads, conversation restrictions relax somewhat given the practical necessities of travel. This creates rare opportunity for more direct discussion of monastic experience with brothers who have shared your environment, yet necessarily experienced it through their individual psychological perspectives. During an evening rest at a wayside shrine, Brother Gabriel, the senior monk leading your group, initiates unusual conversation about the nature of monastic psychology. Each of us has struggled differently with aspects of our life, he observes, breaking the customary avoidance of personal reflection. Yet, we've all found ways to sustain commitment despite challenges. What practices have most helped each of you manage the difficulties of our vocation? This direct inquiry into psychological experience represents rare explicit acknowledgement of the internal adaptations necessary for sustainable monastic life. The responses from different brothers reveal diverse strategies developed through years of confronting the distinctive challenges of monastic psychology: isolation, repetition, sensory restriction, communal living without intimate connection, and constant performance of regulated behaviors regardless of internal state. Brother Thomas, youngest among your group at 32, identifies structured time as his essential support. The bells saved me during periods of doubt. When my mind rebelled against purpose or meaning, my body still moved to their summons, carrying me through darkness until light returned. This dependence on external temporal structure for psychological continuity during interior disruption appears repeatedly in monastic writings across centuries, suggesting fundamental insight into how temporal frameworks can sustain coherence when subjective meaning fluctuates. Brother Andrew, whose 25 years in monastic life included visible periods of struggle with acedia, spiritual apathy, emphasizes physical labor, working with my hands until exhaustion prevented the endless circular thinking that consumed me when idle. The garden became my sanctuary when the church felt empty. This recognition of embodied activity as psychological protection against rumination and existential questioning reflects a sophisticated understanding of body-mind connections centuries before their scientific validation. Your own response identifies attentional practice as most crucial, learning to direct and redirect awareness intentionally, first through structured meditation on Scripture, and later through continuous brief prayers during work and movement. This capacity to choose the mind's focus rather than follow its wandering has made everything else sustainable. This cultivation of attentional control through deliberate practice anticipates contemporary cognitive science's recognition of attention regulation as fundamental to psychological well-being. Brother Gabriel nods at these varied responses, adding his own perspective from 4 decades of monastic experience. For me, it was recognizing that periods of emptiness and fullness both serve the spiritual journey. When younger, I fought against acedia as enemy. With age, I came to see it as necessary winter of the soul that prepares for spring's return. This cyclical understanding of psychological states reflects a sophisticated recognition of emotional rhythms and their potential meaning beyond immediate subjective experience. This rare, explicit discussion of internal adaptation strategies unveils the hidden psychological technologies developed through centuries of monastic experience. Behind the visible structures of scheduled prayer, restricted environment, and regulated behavior existed a sophisticated understanding of how humans actually function within such constraints. Knowledge gained through collective experience with the challenges and possibilities of the monastic psychological ecosystem. As your journey continues toward the new foundation, you consider how these monastic psychological insights might translate beyond religious contexts into contemporary challenges that parallel certain aspects of the monastic condition. Modern research increasingly validates connections between medieval monastic practices and current psychological understanding in several key areas: attention management in distracted environments, the monastic development of structured attentional practices, from formal meditation to brief prayer words that redirect awareness during activity, offers relevant techniques for contemporary struggles with digital distraction and continuous partial attention. Modern mindfulness approaches often rediscover principles developed through centuries of monastic experimentation, with sustained attention in environments designed to limit sensory stimulation without eliminating potential distraction, finding meaning in repetition and routine. The monastic approach to repetitive activities, transforming them through intentional framing and symbolic understanding rather than seeking constant novelty, provides alternative perspective for cultures struggling with hedonic adaptation and constant stimulation seeking. The psychological techniques developed for finding depth within limitation rather than escape from it offer potential resources for sustainable satisfaction in contrast to consumption-based approaches to well-being, managing isolation and navigating solitude. Monastic technologies for constructive engagement with reduced social contact structured time, meaningful intellectual projects, physical activity integrated with mental discipline, and community contact balanced with individual space, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human needs in isolation that gained renewed relevance during pandemic restrictions and increasing recognition of loneliness as public health challenge, balancing individual and communal needs. The monastic negotiation between institutional regulation and personal adaptation, finding sustainable middle paths that preserved essential structures while accommodating human variation, offers instructive models for contemporary community design, organizational psychology, and institutional development, seeking balance between necessary standardization and individual flourishing, creating psychological continuity through physical embodiment. The monastic integration of bodily practices with psychological development, using physical postures, movements, and sensations to influence mental states, anticipated contemporary embodied cognition research by centuries, while developing practical techniques for utilizing these connections in everyday experience, developing healthy relationships with time. The monastic temporal system, combining cyclical patterns with progressive development, immediate experience with historical continuity, and personal time with institutional rhythms, created sophisticated temporal consciousness that balanced change and stability in ways potentially instructive for contemporary struggles with temporal fragmentation, acceleration, and disconnection from natural and historical timescales, cultivating attention as fundamental capacity. The monastic recognition that attention regulation forms the foundation for all other psychological and spiritual development, the capacity to direct and maintain awareness intentionally rather than reactively, anticipates contemporary cognitive sciences' identification of attentional control as essential to psychological well-being and effective functioning across domains. As your group arrives at the site designated for the new foundation, a modest stone building with attached lands donated by a local nobleman seeking spiritual benefits, you begin the process of establishing monastic life in this new setting. The physical creation of sacred space, arrangement of areas for specific functions, and implementation of the daily schedule all reflect the accumulated psychological wisdom of centuries of monastic experience, with creating environments that shape consciousness in particular ways. The walls that define sacred space from secular surroundings, the deliberate acoustic properties that support chant and prayer, the arrangement of seating to facilitate both communal awareness and individual focus, the careful management of light through window placement and candle positioning, all represent sophisticated environmental psychology developed through centuries of monastic experience with how physical settings influence interior states. These design elements reflect implicit understanding of environment consciousness relationships centuries before their formal scientific study. As days pass in the new foundation and routines gradually establish themselves, you observe how the psychological technologies of monasticism transfer from one physical setting to another while maintaining essential functions. The bells marking temporal divisions still structure consciousness despite different acoustics in the new location. The bodily patterns of prayer, standing, kneeling, processing, bowing still create their characteristic effects on attention and emotion despite altered spatial arrangements. The social technologies of regulated interaction and distributed responsibilities still generate community cohesion despite the smaller group size. This transferability demonstrates how monastic psychology operated through principles rather than merely specific implementations, fundamental insights about human psychological functioning that maintained effectiveness across varying circumstances. These underlying principles, rather than their particular medieval manifestations, constitute the most valuable aspects of monastic psychology for contemporary consideration. 2 months into establishing the new foundation, a messenger arrives from the mother house with news that creates unexpected connection between your monastic experience and wider historical currents. Political political changes have accelerated, with new authorities questioning traditional monastic land holdings and privileges. The Mother House faces potential restrictions that may eventually affect even your small dependent foundation. This situation reflects historical patterns repeated throughout medieval monasticism, where external political and economic pressures repeatedly forced adaptation and occasionally led to dissolution of long-established communities. As your small group discusses these developments, the conversation reveals another dimension of monastic psychological wisdom, perspectives on impermanence and institutional contingency developed through centuries of navigating historical change, despite theoretical commitment to stability. Brother Gabriel expresses this understanding. The rule endures, even when particular houses do not. Our walls may stand 1,000 years or fall tomorrow, but the knowledge of this way of life continues either way. This recognition of continuity beyond specific manifestations represents sophisticated understanding of how traditions persist through adaptation rather than rigid preservation, maintaining essential principles while modifying implementations according to changing circumstances. The historical record confirms this pattern, with core monastic insights repeatedly surviving institutional disruptions through transformation and reinterpretation rather than unchanged continuity. Your own reflection on potential changes mirrors this adaptability. Perhaps we build here for centuries, or perhaps for a brief moment in history. Either way, the work forms us as we perform it. This psychology of meaningful process rather than guaranteed outcome reflects monastic wisdom about finding purpose in present action rather than attachment to specific results, an approach with clear relevance to contemporary challenges of meaning-making amid uncertainty and rapid change. As autumn approaches and your new foundation establishes sustainable patterns, you continue integrating the psychological technologies developed through your 20 years in the Mother House while adapting them to new circumstances. The daily schedule maintains essential structure while accommodating local conditions. The prayer practices preserve core elements while adjusting to different acoustic and architectural realities. The social regulations uphold necessary boundaries while relaxing certain formalities impossible to maintain in a smaller community. This process of principled adaptation rather than rigid replication or complete abandonment embodies the most valuable legacy of monastic psychology, the understanding that human flourishing requires neither unlimited freedom nor inflexible regulation, but thoughtful negotiation between structure and flexibility, tradition and innovation, community and individuality. This balanced approach, developed through centuries of practical experience with creating sustainable patterns for human development, offers continuing relevance beyond its religious origins. As winter approaches and the new foundation prepares for its first Christmas cycle, you find unexpected satisfaction in this transplanted monastic life. Despite reduced resources, smaller community, and uncertain future, the psychological foundations established through years of monastic practice provide surprising resilience. The attention management techniques still function despite changed surroundings. The temporal structuring still provides orientation despite altered schedules. The physical disciplines still support psychological continuity despite modified facilities. This sustainability across changing circumstances demonstrates the robust nature of monastic psychological technologies, their effectiveness deriving from alignment with fundamental human needs and capacities, rather than dependency on specific historical or institutional conditions. These enduring aspects of monastic psychology, separated from their particular medieval manifestations and religious frameworks, continue offering insights applicable to contemporary human experience across diverse contexts and beliefs. The bells sound for Vespers in your new foundation, calling the small community to to evening prayer as darkness descends on approaching winter. The sound travels differently across this landscape than in the mother house, yet serves identical function in structuring consciousness and communal synchronization. This continuity within change represents the essential legacy of monastic psychology, not specific historical practices bound to particular beliefs, but enduring insights about attention, meaning, embodiment, time, and community that transcend their origins while honoring the tradition that developed them through centuries of careful observation of the human mind, under conditions of limitation, repetition, and structure. Conclusion. Beyond romanticization and dismissal, the lived reality of medieval monastic life reveals psychological complexity that transcends both idealistic romanticization and simplistic dismissal. Neither the serene sanctuary of modern spiritual imagination nor the oppressive prison of secular critique, the monastery created a distinctive psychological ecosystem with sophisticated adaptations to extreme conditions that offer nuanced lessons about human capacity for meaning-making within constraint. The winter solstice marks 6 months since establishing your small foundation. The longest night of the year finds your community rising for matins in profound darkness that recalls similar nights across your 20 years of monastic experience. As you take your place in the modest choir stalls of your new church, the familiar Latin prayers create temporal bridge connecting present experience to countless previous observances while extending forward into uncertain future continuity. This solstice observance embodies the fundamental insight emerging from examined monastic experience that human psychological flourishing requires neither unlimited options nor complete freedom from structure, but rather meaningful frameworks that balance constraint and adaptation, tradition and innovation, individual development and communal belonging. The monastery created highly restrictive conditions that nonetheless generated remarkable creativity, intellectual development, and psychological sophistication through careful attention to how limitations could be navigated rather than simply imposed or rejected. Contemporary perspectives often view medieval monasticism through distorting lenses of either romantic idealization or dismissive critique. Modern spiritual seekers sometimes imagine the monastery as peaceful retreat from worldly complexity, projecting simplified serenity onto a historical reality that involved sophisticated negotiation of very real challenges. Secular critics alternatively dismiss monastic life as mere oppressive restriction, failing to recognize the complex adaptations and genuine flourishing possible within its structured environment. The historical evidence reveals a reality far more complex and instructive than either projection. Medieval monks weren't serene spiritual automatons floating above human psychological needs, nor were they broken victims of religious oppression. They were individuals navigating highly structured environment with varying degrees of success, developing sophisticated adaptations to extreme conditions that demonstrate remarkable human capacity for finding meaning and purpose within constraint rather than through its absence. As your small community completes the extended night office and processes back through darkness toward brief rest before dawn prayer, you reflect on what your monastic years have truly taught about the human mind and its capacities. Beyond specific religious frameworks and historical particulars, these insights address fundamental psychological questions relevant across contexts. How does attention function under different conditions? What creates sustainable meaning amid repetition? How do individuals and communities balance necessary structure with equally necessary adaptation? What environments best support human flourishing across different dimensions of experience? The monastic response to these questions emerged not through abstract theory, but through centuries of practical experience with actual human functioning under particular conditions. The resulting psychological technologies, from attention management techniques to temporal structuring systems to environmental designs influencing consciousness, represent collective wisdom about human capabilities and limitations developed through direct observation rather than speculative understanding. This practical wisdom offers continuing relevance beyond religious contexts, particularly for contemporary challenges involving attention fragmentation, meaning construction, technological acceleration, environmental design, and community sustainability. The monastic insight that structure can enable, rather than merely restrict certain forms of human flourishing, provides alternative perspective to simplistic associations of freedom with unlimited choice or self-determination with absence of constraint. Your own experience across 20 years embodied this complexity, documenting both the very real struggles with isolation, repetition, and restriction alongside genuine development of capacities that might have remained dormant in less structured environments. The astronomical calculations pursued within limited free time represented not rebellion against monastic regulation, but creative adaptation within it, finding intellectual freedom through disciplined engagement with limitation rather than its rejection. The small carved wooden cross given by Brother Andrew at your departure from the Mother House rests in your new cell, visible reminder of how authentic human connection emerged despite prohibitions against particular relationships. The complex emotion attached to this simple object, gratitude, memory, affection regulated but not eliminated by monastic frameworks, demonstrates how genuine human needs found expression within, rather than despite institutional structures designed to redirect them. The entire monastic system, viewed through historical evidence rather than ideological projection, reveals sophisticated understanding of how structural limitations and human adaptability could productively engage rather than merely oppose each other. The rule provided essential framework while recognizing necessary flexibility through concepts like dispensation and economy that acknowledged human variation. The community maintained crucial boundaries while developing unofficial adaptations that allowed sustainable implementation of theoretical ideals. The individual accepted significant restrictions while finding creative possibilities within designated parameters. This balanced approach, neither unregulated individualism nor inflexible conformity, created distinctive psychological environment that fostered certain capacities while undoubtedly limiting others. The monastic emphasis on attention regulation developed remarkable capacities for sustained focus and present awareness, while restricting exploration of certain emotional and relational dimensions. The temporal structuring created exceptional orientation within cyclical patterns, while limiting spontaneous response to emergent opportunities. The physical disciplines generated sophisticated integration of embodied experience, while constraining certain forms of sensory engagement and expression. As dawn approaches on this solstice day, and your community prepares for continued observance, this complex legacy informs your understanding of both historical monasticism and its contemporary relevance. The monastery was neither utopia nor prison, but distinctive human adaptation that revealed specific aspects of psychological potential through particular forms of limitation and structure. Its greatest wisdom lies not in its specific religious manifestations, but in its demonstration of how meaning emerges through engagement with constraint rather than merely freedom from it. This perspective offers valuable counterbalance to contemporary emphases on unlimited choice, unrestricted self-expression, and rejection of traditional frameworks as inherently oppressive, without romanticizing genuine historical limitations or dismissing real psychological costs. The monastic experience demonstrates how structure can enable distinct forms of human flourishing when approached as creative framework rather than mere restriction. This insight that certain capacities develop precisely through engagement with limitation rather than its absence provides nuanced middle ground between uncritical traditionalism and reflexive rejection of all inherited structures. The solstice sun finally rises beyond your new foundation's modest eastern window, illuminating the small gathering of monks who have created transplanted continuity of ancient practice in new setting. The light gradually transforms the space, revealing both its its resemblance to the mother house and its distinctive adaptations to local conditions. This simultaneous continuity and variation aptly symbolizes the enduring wisdom of monastic psychology, maintaining essential insights while adapting implementations, honoring tradition without rigid replication, and finding fresh expression of enduring principles. As you begin another day in this structured yet dynamic tradition, the monastery's psychological legacy continues unfolding, not as fossil of historical curiosity, but as living demonstration of human capacity for creating meaning through engagement with limitation rather than escape from it. This fundamental insight, developed through centuries of practical experience with actual human functioning under particular conditions, offers continuing relevance for contemporary questions about attention, purpose, community, and flourishing. Enduring wisdom, emerging from what might initially appear most alien to modern sensibilities. The bells sound for prime as full daylight reaches your small foundation. The cycle continues, structured yet adaptive, constrained yet creative, embodiment of psychological understanding that transcends its historical manifestations while honoring the tradition that developed it through centuries of careful observation of the human mind, under conditions that revealed particular aspects of its remarkable capacity for finding meaning within, rather than merely beyond limitation. If you've made it through this exploration of medieval monastic psychology, perhaps you've glimpsed something beyond the simplistic images of either serene saints floating above human needs or oppressed victims denied authentic existence. The reality revealed by historical evidence suggests something far more nuanced and instructive. Individuals navigating highly structured environment through sophisticated adaptations that demonstrated remarkable human capacity for finding meaning and purpose within constraint. Next time you struggle with attention fragmentation amid digital distraction, consider the monastic technologies for attention management developed across centuries of practice. When repetitive tasks or routines feel meaningless, recall the monastic approaches to finding depth within limitation rather than escape from it. If isolation challenges your psychological well-being, remember the structured temporal systems that supported monks through solitude. And when institutional demands seem to conflict with personal needs, consider the balanced negotiations that allowed monasticism to sustain itself for centuries, despite its theoretical rigidity. The most valuable legacy of monastic psychology may be this fundamental insight that human flourishing emerges not through absence of structure, but through creative engagement with meaningful frameworks that balance constraint and adaptation, tradition and innovation, individual development and communal belonging. This nuanced middle path between uncritical acceptance of limitation and reflexive rejection of all structure offers continuing wisdom from a tradition that, while seemingly distant from contemporary experience, addressed fundamental questions about human psychology that remain essential across centuries of change. Sleep well tonight in your heated home with its soft mattress and private spaces, grateful for comforts. Medieval monks deliberately denied themselves, yet perhaps slightly curious about capacities they might have developed that remain largely dormant in contemporary environments optimized for comfort rather than transformation. The monastery's bells have largely fallen silent, but their invitation to alternative understanding of human flourishing continues echoing for those willing to hear beyond both romantic idealization and dismissive critique, finding the complex reality where genuine wisdom typically resides.